I call this meeting to order. This is the 89th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. Orders of the day pursuant to the order of reference of Tuesday, October 30th, 2012, continuing our study of Bill C-45, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget tabled in Parliament on March 29, 2012, and other measures. Colleagues, we have two panels with us here this afternoon, early evening. In our first panel, we have the first organization is the Bank of Canada. The second organization is the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. We have the Certified General Accountants Association of Canada, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and we have TSGI Chartered Accountants. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being with us here this afternoon. You each have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and we'll start with Mr. Turnbull, work our way down the row, and then we'll have questions from members after that.
I guess I'd better hurry. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and honourable members of the committee. The Bank of Canada is very pleased to appear before the committee today, and what we've been asked to talk about to assist the committee is the amendments in Part 4, Division 3 of Bill C-45. These are the amendments to a piece of legislation that I'm sure keeps you up late at night called the Payment Clearing and Settlement Act. So what I'd like to do is just deliver a fairly brief opening statement. It is a fairly technical topic. I tried to be as clear as I could, and then I'd be pleased to try to answer your questions about these particular amendments. Je commence en français.
I will be beginning in French. At the 2009 G20 summit in Pittsburgh, the leaders agreed that standardized over-the-counter derivatives contracts should be cleared through central counterparty clearing systems by the end of 2012. A CCP is a financial market infrastructure that stands between buyers and sellers in financial transactions, ensuring that obligations will be met on all contracts that are cleared through the CPP. By managing and also by mitigating counterparty credit risk, CCPs have the potential to reduce systemic risk, both globally and in Canada. They reduce the potential for financial shocks to be transmitted through the financial system and support the ability of markets to remain continuously open even in times of stress. About a month ago, Canadian authorities reconfirmed their G20 commitment to central clearing, and they indicated that Canadian participants in the derivatives market can respect this commitment by clearing derivatives contracts through the global cross-border clearing systems that are currently being developed in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Regardless of whether derivatives are cleared through a central counterparty in Canada or abroad, Canadian laws will be applied to determine the rights and the obligations of Canadian participants and their customers. It is therefore important for financial stability in Canada that the transfers of assets among central counterparties, Canadian participants, and also their customers for the clearing and settlement of derivatives transactions are protected from possible legal challenges in the event that a Canadian participant were to become insolvent.
Now, the main statute in Canada for protecting clearing and settlement systems from legal challenges in the event of the failure of a participant is the act that we're dealing with here, the Payment Clearing and Settlement Act, or as we call it, the PCSA. The PCSA gives the Bank of Canada responsibility for the regulatory oversight of clearing systems that could pose systemic risk. The PCSA also provides a number of important legal protections for these systems. In particular, it ensures that the rights of a clearinghouse to be paid, to settle transactions, and to deal with collateral deposited by its participants will not be stayed or unwound under the insolvency statutes if a participant defaults. Now, the purpose of these protections is to ensure that a clearinghouse will be able to exercise its legal rights to settle the system within a reasonable time frame following a default, and that it will have sufficient rights in the assets deposited by participants to ensure that the clearinghouse itself is not brought down by a failure of one or more participants, thereby propagating systemic risk.
One minute, Mr. Turnbull. You have 1 minute remaining. You have 1 minute remaining in your opening
sorry.
statement.
Okay. Now, the PCSA was enacted in 1996 primarily to address systems that settle payment obligations. While it's been updated since that time to provide for the clearing of securities and derivatives, many of the legal protections in the Act are worded in a way that they simply do not apply to the clearing of derivatives contracts. For example, the protections for enforceability of settlement rules in Section 8 of the Act are limited to clearinghouse rules that provide for the calculation, netting, or settlement of payment obligations. It's doubtful whether these necessary protections extend to the clearing of derivatives contracts and the transfers of collateral and other assets that support derivatives clearing systems. So really the purpose of these amendments, to sum up within the time that I have, is simply to fix up the wording of the PCSA so that the legal protections that it provides clearly apply to the type of clearing that goes on in these now all-important central counterparty systems for clearing derivatives. And I'll just add one final point, that this has a competitive aspect as well, because currently Canadian banks who are very active in the derivatives markets are restricted from participating in some of these offshore CCPs because of the concerns of those CCPs and their regulators about potential gaps in Canadian law. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from the Canadian manufacturers and exporters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting us to appear today for Bill C-45. CME represents about 10,000 manufacturers and exporters across the country who account for 80% of Canada's manufacturing production and over 90% of all exports of goods and services. Innovation and productivity, as you obviously, are two increasingly important drivers of manufacturing growth in industrialized countries, and Canada is not an exception. In the last 10 years, Canadian manufacturers had to cope with an increased competition from developing markets, combined with a very rapid appreciation of the Canadian dollar. The only sustainable strategy on the long term is a stronger focus on innovation and productivity. From that perspective, I will focus my remarks today on the proposed changes to the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Tax Credit, the SR&ED tax credit, which is, for our members, the most important issue in this legislation. The Canadian manufacturing sector, despite representing now about 14% of Canada's GDP, accounts for 55% of all business R&D expenditures in Canada. It is by far the most R&D intensive industry in the country. Roughly half of SR&ED users are actually manufacturers. Last week, CME published a special report on the economic impact of the proposed changes to SR&ED on business innovation in Canada. The first conclusion is that proposed measures will result in a net diminution of R&D performed in Canada. We estimate that all proposed measures by the government will reduce R&D tax incentives in Canada by $750 million a year, starting in 2016-17. To give you an idea of the size, this amount represented 5% of all business R&D expenditures in Canada last year. In our sector, according to our latest management issues survey, 69% of manufacturers will reduce R&D spending, while another 20% will start looking at other jurisdictions to conduct R&D activities as a result of these changes. We estimate that the full impact of these changes on actual business R&D expenditures in Canada will be approximately $1.5 billion every year. Our report also compared the generosity of the R&D tax credits for large companies in different countries. The international competitiveness of our R&D tax credit will fall from number 13 to number 17 in the OECD as a result of the 5% proposed reduction in the tax credit. The budget also proposed to completely eliminate capital expenditure from the tax base. Again, no other sectors of our economy will be impacted as much as the manufacturing sector, which tends to have more capital-intensive R&D activities. While on average in the overall economy, only about 5% of all R&D expenditures are related to capital, in our sector it is more than 30%. Our report compared the fiscal treatment of capital expenditures related to R&D in other countries. The vast majority of countries studied provide either a tax credit or a rapid depreciation rate, such as the UK, for example, for capital expenditures related to R&D. Again, our international attractiveness as a destination for R&D will decrease. Another change in the budget was the reduction of the proxy used for claiming overhead costs under the SHRED program. So by proposing to reduce the proxy from 65 to 55%, the government estimates that the proxy is too generous, and therefore, and that reducing it would best reflect the actual overhead cost of companies. We have not seen any evidence or analysis provided by the Department of Finance that suggests that this is really the case. We rather believe that the use of the proxy has to do with the simplification of the claim process, as suggested by the Jenkins panel in their report, and therefore the government should proceed with a full analysis before making a change that will make more companies turn into the traditional method of claiming overheads instead of using the proxy. Because we think that this will increase compliance costs for companies, and it will also add burden on CRA's auditors. That was also a key recommendation of the Jenkins report. In conclusion, there are three ways at looking at the impact of these proposed changes on business R&D. In terms of actual dollars, as I said, changes will reduce business expenditures in R&D to an estimated $1.5 billion a year once all the measures are implemented. In terms of taxation of large companies, the negative impact of the 5% reduction in SHRED exceed by far all the benefits that resulted with the CIT cuts that have taken place at the federal level since 2008, if you look only at the large manufacturers. In terms of international competitiveness and our capacity to attract foreign investment from large R&D performers, our ranking will decrease from number 13 to number 17. And even more importantly, all the major developing countries such as India, China, Turkey, and Brazil will now offer a more advantageous R&D tax credit, according to our report. We are making three main recommendations that will mitigate the negative impact of these proposed changes. First one is to provide more direct support to large companies by the way of a partially refundable tax credit, which would be targeted at projects related to enhanced productivity, allow companies to depreciate more rapidly the cost of machinery and equipment used for R&D purpose, and conduct a more detailed analysis of overhead costs and the use of the proxy before implementing the 10% reduction. Thank you very much for your time. I'm available to respond to questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from Certified General Accountants Association of Canada, please.
Monsieur le Président, membres du comité, je m'appelle Carole.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Carole Valtu. I'm the Vice Chairman of this committee, an organization made up of general certified accountants in Canada. I'm very happy to participate in your study of Bill C-45. This bill is quite weighty, but much of its content is of great interest to our members, and our comments today will deal with two aspects with respect to Division 14 and the tax system, the fiscal system.
Measures related to the internal trade contained in Division 14 and measures regarding the tax system. The measures included in Division 14 implement financial penalties and enforcement provisions to support the decision of panels that are formed to adjudicate disputes between parties to the Agreement on Internal Trade. I'm sorry, I skipped a page, I'm sorry. I'm going to come back. These measures implement changes to the Agreement on Internal Trade, which were agreed to by federal, provincial, and territorial governments over the past few years. Let me remind you that the purpose of the Agreement on Internal Trade is to reduce and, where possible, eliminate unnecessary barriers to interprovincial trade and labor mobility. It's not a perfect agreement, and the Committee on Internal Trade was formed to ensure the agreement continues to meet its objectives and improve the agreement that was signed more than 12 years ago. Implementing the measures in Division 14 is a demonstration of the federal government's commitment to comply with its obligation under the agreement. So the measures contained in the bill before us implements financial penalties and enforcement provisions to support decisions of panels and that were formed to adjudicate disputes between parties. These measures addressed a serious flaw. Previously to this, there was little incentive for governments to comply with panel rulings, as we discovered through our own experiences. By the way, it's also worth noting that until the measures in Division 14 are enacted, the Canadian government has lost its right to access the AIT under the AIT's dispute resolution provisions. We support the measures contained in the bill. But we know there's still much the Committee on Internal Trade can do to further improve the agreement, particularly to improve efficiency and accessibility of the dispute resolution process. The process is a long one and a costly one, and citizens cannot access the process independently of government. Also needed are improvements to the AIT governance that would enable more stakeholder engagement and improve transparency. But we are encouraged that ministers have agreed to developing a chapter on technical barriers to trade. This is a problematic approach to trade, both interprovincially and internationally, and success in this area would help advance two of the government's priority issues, as increasing international trade and reducing red tape. And the timing couldn't be better to address these issues. As of December, the federal government becomes chair of the Committee on Internal Trade and has the opportunity to drive the agenda. We encourage the government to seize this opportunity to make the agreement a truly effective tool for strengthening the economic union. Second, and committee members won't be surprised to hear us talk again about taxation, we note with interest that Part 1 of Bill C-45 implements a number of income tax measures and related measures proposed in the March 2012 budgets. Measures that we've had the opportunity to comment on in previous process includes the Registered Disability Savings Plan, as my colleague Mr. Lavoie mentioned, the SHRED tax credit, and of course international taxation. Many of these members stem from the work of advisory panels, for example, the Canadian System of International Taxation and the SHRED measures from the Jenkins panel. And it leads me to highlight once again the importance of expert advisory panels in advancing change to public policies. I'm confident, thank you. I'm confident members would agree with us given their recommendation in last year's pre-budget. I want to talk about a measure that we did not see in the 2012 budget that continues to be a priority to our members and to taxpayers everywhere, is the issue of a sunset provision to ensure that tax changes are enacted within a reasonable amount of time after being introduced in a budget. Today, you focus your efforts on improving policy changes announced in Budget Plan 2012, but we need to remember that there are still hundreds of tax measures from previous federal budgets that still have not been enacted. And we would encourage to consider the application of a sunset clause to ensure that coming forward of these amendments in a reasonable amount of time. I'd like to remind you that the bill is entitled the Jobs and Growth Act. We submit that removing barriers to internal trade and mobility and taking steps to simplify Canada's tax systems are critical to jobs growth and Canada's long-term prosperity. Je vous remercie pour l'occasion et ça me fera plaisir de participer à la
I would like to thank you for this opportunity, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. Next.
Your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present to you this afternoon. My name is Chris Aylward. I'm the National Executive Vice President of the Public Service Alliance of Canada. We represent approximately 170,000 federal public sector workers. The Public Service Alliance of Canada has major concerns with the latest budget implementation bill, C-45. Many of these legislative changes will have a drastic impact on Canadians and should not be rushed through Parliament without time for careful consideration, scrutiny, and debate. My first comments are on the proposed changes to the federal public sector pension plans. These unilateral changes include increasing the normal retirement age from 60 to 65 for new hires beginning in 2013. PSAC opposes Bill C-45 because it is an attack on younger generations who make up the majority of new hires in the federal public sector. The increase in the retirement age will generate a two-tier system, creating inequities between young and older workers in the public service, forcing younger workers to retire at an older age. The public service pension plan is sustainable, and there is no reason to penalize young workers. Members of this committee should also be aware that the Canada Pension Plan and Quebec pension payments are integrated with federal public service pensions, and that the average annual pension received by retired federal public sector workers in 2011 was $25,991. PSAC calls on the government to focus on strengthening pensions for all Canadians instead of weakening pension plans and retirement security for those dedicated to public service. I also want to touch on a change to the Canada Revenue Agency Act contained in Bill C-45, and I speak from a very personal advantage on this. This change will put the agency back under the authority of Treasury Board to oversee CRA's negotiating mandate, as well as certain terms and conditions of employment. This is a serious step backwards. Not only does the change in authority contradict some of the very reasons for creating the agency in the first place, it undermines a decade of hard work by the PSAC and the agency that have been put in place to develop effective labor relations. In fact, during the last two rounds of negotiations, both parties put considerable effort into reaching a settlement with the agency before the current collective agreement had expired, a first in the federal public service. The PSAC has other concerns about Bill C-45 that echo much of the criticism being expressed by environmental, scientific, and Aboriginal groups and individual Canadians. I will not address these other concerns due to time constraints today. However, I will be providing the clerk of the committee with a short summary of our additional concerns for your information. We believe Canadians are not well served by omnibus bills. Bill C-45 should be broken down into individual pieces of legislation so that parliamentarians and all Canadians have ample opportunity to study and understand the consequences of the proposed changes. Before I close, I will take a few moments to reiterate our concern about significant changes to programs and services that affect the livelihoods, environment, and safety of Canadians. Changes that are being made without transparency and without hearing from those who depend on the services. Search and rescue and Coast Guard stations are being shut down, despite the pleas to reconsider coming from coastal communities. Veterans Affairs district offices are being closed across the country, including the one and only office in Prince Edward Island located in Charlottetown. And caseloads are almost doubling, despite the desperate situation faced by our veterans. The Department of Fisheries budget and fisheries habitat staff are being cut. Yet the recently issued Cohen Commission of Inquiry report into the decline of salmon in the Fraser River reaffirmed the importance of restoring the Department of Fisheries mandate and resources to protect fish habitat. We believe there is a need for more transparency about the scope and impact of all planned cuts to federal services and programs, and a need to listen to Canadians being affected. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. We will now hear from TSGI Chartered Accountants, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and committee members. By way of introduction, I'd like to make a few comments about my background as it relates to SR&ED and R&D funding. I have more than 30 years as a chartered accountant with a computer science degree and an MBA. In the past, I was a full-time faculty member at the University of Calgary and taught the most recent Institute of CAs in Alberta SRED courses. The past 10 years of my practice, which consists of my practice has consisted of about 10 qualified scientists and CAs who focus solely on the SR&ED area, to both multinational corporations as well as small corporations, mostly in Western Canada. I believe I have a unique multidisciplinary outlook on SR&ED. I'm from the trenches. I've also worked with the National Research Council's IRAP program, and our firm was the company that submitted the first successful shale gas technology claim in Canada. I've served as the inaugural chairman of the Joint CRA Industry Information Technology Oversight Committee for the Shred Prairie region, and I'm an active participant as an angel investor in Western Canada, both through direct investments and also a membership in Venture Alberta, which is reputed to be one of the most active venture forums in Canada. And this provides me with further insight into the technology startup community. To begin with, I would like to summarize the overall impact we anticipate the changes proposed in Bill C-45 will have on SR&ED performers at the ground level. Our company has gone through a detailed modeling process to simulate the SR&ED impact of the 2012 budget on our clients, which should be considered to be a cross-section of Western Canadian companies. We did this because the microeconomic nuances of how policy decisions affect individual organizations are not always visible from a macroeconomic viewpoint. Our conclusion is that Canadian-controlled private corporations, or CCPCs, are likely to experience a 5 to 10% reduction in investment tax credits, whereas non-CCPCs, those are the big ones, can expect more drastic reductions in the order of 30 to 40%. The industry consensus communicated to us both by our clients and by contacts is that the reductions in the shred benefits will unquestionably reduce their overall ability and willingness to conduct research in Canada and, well, reduce jobs, and this should be a concern for all Canadians. I'm also particularly concerned about the impact of the proposed changes on the energy industry, which will have effects nationwide. The implications can be extrapolated to numerous industrial sectors in Canada over the long term. The primary story of oil and gas in Canada is no longer a story of wildcat wells and exploration uncertainties. It is primarily a technology story, that is, of using new technology to unlock unconventional resources that were previously inaccessible. This fundamental shift is highlighted by the fact that in 2010, oil sands production overtook conventional oil as the leading production method in Canada with 51.9% of production. The technology needed to turn unconventional resources into producible reserves and a contribution to our GDP is extraordinarily sophisticated and extraordinarily expensive, with sourcing requirements that reach beyond Alberta's borders. Every day we see Canadian energy companies taking enormous risks to develop new technology. The largest spenders in oil and gas research are most commonly in the non-CCPC category, and they will be the hardest hit by the reduction in investment tax credits. In particular, the reduction in the general ITC rate from 20 to 15% and the elimination of capital expenditures will severely impact these organizations. In our view, the impact that these changes will have on the energy industry warrants reevaluation of the proposed policy changes. We believe that public innovation policy is best delivered in an indirect form, which organically results in leveraging industries where Canada has a natural advantage in the ability to develop, commercialize, and exploit technology. There are few other industries in Canada that have such advantages as we do in the energy sector. We are world leaders now, and we need to stay there to protect Canada's economic future. Thank you. We need to enhance our competitiveness in this increasingly technological field to build world champions. Reductions to the SRED program will dramatically alter the positive path we are currently on in the energy industry, along with many sectors that industry impacts. Lastly, I'd like to comment on the critical issue of how the proposed changes will affect jobs in Canada. R&D performers in Western Canada tell us that they will react to the concerns outlined above by reducing their research efforts in Canada. This has already started to happen. Research capital is highly liquid, and these companies are not afraid to redistribute their funds to other jurisdictions. They also recognize that we are locked in a global war for talented innovators, and they must either initially attract and then keep our innovators in Canada or go to where these individuals are. We are deeply concerned that the net effect of the proposed SRED changes will be the loss of high-value innovation jobs. This will have significant and long-term negative effects on our global competitiveness. Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll begin members' questions with Ms. Nash for a 5-minute round, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to all of the witnesses today. I want to begin with the two presentations on the SHRED tax credit, and just ask, first of all, to you, Mr. Lavoie, your organization represents how many companies?
About 10,000 companies.
About 10,000 companies, and out of those companies, how many did you say on average, would take advantage of the SHRED tax credit?
Roughly half of them. But no, sorry. What I said is that roughly half of the SHRED claimants are manufacturing companies. I would expect, more than 80% of our members to claim SHRED.
So this, as the voice of the manufacturing business sector, you understand and you've conveyed to us the importance of this tax credit. And if I understand you correctly, the sector that you represent provides, was it 55% of R&D in Canada? Now, as I understand it, over the last decade, correct me if I'm wrong, we've lost about 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs. Is that correct?
That's roughly that, yeah.
And through a variety of factors, obviously we had an economic downturn, global competitiveness, technology, a variety of factors. But it seems that most businesses that I speak with talk about the importance of investing in R&D, the importance of innovation, the importance of being cutting edge when it comes to new product development. Would you agree that that's a key factor for our economy and especially for the manufacturing sector?
Yes, that's correct. I think innovation and productivity are two very important drivers of business growth in our sector in the next decade for sure.
If we look around the world, some of the AAA rating economies, the Nordic countries, Germany, Australia, is that the approach they're taking? Are they investing in R&D and innovation? Is that what's leading to their success?
There's a variety of models out there. I would say that very few countries do not offer tax credits for R&D. The vast majority do. And the generosity of the tax credit, Canada is not the most generous tax credit. If you look at large companies, keep in mind that SHRED is in fact 2 systems, one for Canadian-controlled private corporations, which offer a refundable 35% tax credit, and a 20% non-refundable for what you call large companies or non-CCPCs. That being said, keep in mind also that non-CCPCs are not necessarily just large multinationals. The threshold is, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's $400,000 in taxable income. So a lot of mid-sized companies would fall under the large company definition.
Okay, and I noted that the CEO of your organization, Jason Myers, said recently that he's concerned that this change is moving us in the wrong direction by increasing taxes on the companies that are investing most in R&D. It's going to weaken the ability of companies in Canada to compete for investment and every R&D dollar they spend. So I assume that in summary is the approach that your organization is taking.
I guess it's twofold there. The companies, there's of course some companies who don't have the capacity to move R&D in other jurisdictions. So I would say for those companies, I guess the options are limited. But since we're talking about larger companies, a lot of them have actually this mobility, and they will look for the environments where they get the most advantageous return for their investment.
Thank you. I have so many other questions, but I just want to get I've only got about a minute left, and Mr. Elwood, I just want to ask you, you talked about the changes to pensions, and I'm interested in what this is going to mean for young people who are trying to get jobs in the federal public service. Will this mean a delayed entry into the workforce for them because the people who are already there will be staying longer and not retiring? Can you maybe comment on that?
That's not so much our concern. Our concern relies in the fact that what we're going to end up having now is a 2-tier system. And I don't know how attractive now the public service is going to be to younger workers, knowing that if I'm coming in through the door today, I'm going to be on a different pension stream than the person who's already, sitting inside that building. So again,
is that it's less affordable and people feel they're not having the same benefits. It's a lower 2-tier system.
Exactly.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to sort of do a brief summary in terms of the SHRED, but then I have some more specific questions for Ms. Persaud. I was on the Red Tape Reduction Commission, and to be quite frank, as we traveled across the country, I don't think that there was a table that we were at that was not complaining about the shred credit in terms of the complexity, in terms of the, the onerous that it was a whole market industry in itself. So certainly the Jenkins report was a very important report. It was an expert panel. And I understand that they're going to be taking some of the money that was in this complex, very difficult to weave your way through program, and it actually, so it's not being taken out of innovation and that area, it's just being redirected. But Ms. Persaud, did your members have any comments in terms of in the past in terms of the complexity and concerns about this particular program? Because again, every single table, it's funny to hear it's such a great program now when I think I heard everywhere that it was very, very flawed and many challenges.
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct. I think we initially raised, I think, in a pre-budget base back in 2004, concerns that were raised to us by our members about the complexity of the SRED tax credit. I mean, you very benefit from some experts on SRED here, so I'm not certainly a bet. But when we look back, that was one of the key recommendations from the Jenkins panel, was to reduce the complexity. Hand in hand with this, of course, is the government's intent in reviewing the whole issue of fees and contingency fees. And I think you have to look at sort of the balance, sort of the complexity of the system that needs to rely on professionals to be able to do that. So, I mean, that is something that needs to be addressed in the future. But certainly, we haven't seen anything in this legislation that addressed the issue of complexity.
Thank you. So to go to Division 14 that you were talking about, and you said something about your own experience, and can you maybe sort of reflect on your own experience and how these changes might facilitate or make things better for you? You had sounded like you had an example that you didn't have time to articulate.
Oh, I could keep going for many hours, not on SRED as much as on the internal trade agreement. We have a lot of experience. We've been involved directly with 3 challenges that were brought under the dispute resolution procedures of the agreement on internal trade. 2 were person-to-government challenges, and 1 was government-to-government, where the provinces of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and led by Manitoba took a dispute on our behalf against measures in Ontario, which said quickly, summarized, prevented our members to be mobile across provincial jurisdictions. And our experience, until these changes were being proposed, made it that there was no enforcement mechanism. There was no hammer, or there's nothing that would made the government that was found to be contrary to their engagement in internal trade, brought them to account and implemented the panel findings. Over the last several years, I mentioned that the Committee on Internal Trade made a number of improvements, and that was essentially around the issue of monetary penalties, which are on a sliding scale for smaller provinces like PI, for example, $250,000 penalty, to a larger province like Quebec, Ontario, BC in the $5 million range. So we think now we have a stick. There's another stick that is less mentioned because the focus is always on monetary, is one of loss of dispute resolution privileges if one fails to implement panel findings, and we find that equally an important stick. Now, recently in June, the committee approved bringing those changes forward to the other aspect of person to government. But there's still a lot of issues around accessibility of the agreement of citizens or parties to be able to take disputes forward without government's approval. So generally, this is a positive move. Enforcement was the key thing, but we still have to resolve things around the process of accessibility, the issue of accessibility.
Well, Mr. Turnbull, just a quick, do you think that this change during 2008, when we hit the worst of the financial crisis, would this have helped in any way, this measure that's being planned right now?
Certainly the measure that's been adopted by the G20 going back to 2009, which obviously was part of the redoing the whole regulatory structure to try to make sure that a financial crisis like that does not happen again. The commitment there was to try to contain the risk that's caused by these derivatives contracts and the trading of derivatives contracts by requiring that they be after the trade takes place and before the trade is settled, that it be submitted to these a central counterparty so that the risk will be transferred from the original parties to a central counterparty, which itself will be heavily risk-proofed. So the idea behind these amendments to the Payment Clearing and Settlement Act are really to support the idea of making sure that these central counterparties are protected from, in this case, legal risks, that they're protected from the...
I'm sorry, Mr. Turnbull, we're way over Ms. McLeod's time. Can I just remind members, if they do have a question, just to allow enough time for the answer? We'll try to come back to that later in the hearing. I'm terribly sorry about that. Mr. Bryson, it's your time now.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to say that Ms. Presseau, the intervention and the need for tax reform is clear, and that should be something that in our pre-budget consultations you've intervened previously, that should be something we take very seriously. Plus the gray areas in our tax system created by the space and time between the introduction in a budget and the actual implementation through legislation, I think is something that's very important we should consider as part of our pre-budget consultations. Michel Lavoie and Mr. Cudmore, you've made compelling interventions today on the importance of SHRED, and we have with us today Ted Hsu, who's a Member of Parliament for Kingston and the Islands, but is also the Liberal critic for science and technology and an expert in all things SHRED. So, Mr. Hsu.
Thanks. I was interested, Mr. Cudmore, in your remarks that you had done some simulations on the effect of the changes in SHRED on your client base, and your statement also that a lot of the view from the ground out west often isn't seen in Ottawa, and it seems, if I have it right, you're telling us that folks here in Ottawa are not seeing that jobs in oil and gas companies will be affected because the cuts in SHRED will reduce the incentive to do research and development. And because that is a world-leading sector of Canada's economy, indirectly that will affect jobs in all of Canada. If I think I have that right, but I want to ask, are you sure? I mean, you have a limited client base. It's mostly companies in Western Canada. Are you sure that? Do you have any other evidence that what you find from your client base would apply more generally?
No, other than anecdotal information and talking with people who have practices in the major accounting firms that spread Canada, and I'm not sure whether the data that they were expressing was across Canada or simply the Western numbers, but some of them were even higher than the numbers that I gave you.
Well, based on what you do know for sure, which is your own client base. What do you see from your own client base in terms of the numbers of research and development dollars that might go outside of Canada, be spent outside of Canada because of the reductions to SHRED?
Well, all we have is anecdotal information. In other words, when we talk to tax managers and CEOs of companies, and they tell us what's happening with respect to their budgets, the oil and gas industry is extremely fluid. They will turn on and turn off a billion-dollar project like that, and it all depends upon what is happening. And what we find with R&D is that the scientists within these companies have to fight for the opportunity to do this SR&ED work, and they have to fight against other projects. And shale gas would never have occurred, and shale gas has been a game changer for all of Canada and North America. And that probably wouldn't have happened if they hadn't been able to have some tipping point, and the SR&ED program is quite often that tipping point that allows those engineers and those scientists to go forward with some of these technologies that push the envelope beyond where we ever anticipated it could go.
In terms of the complexity of SHRED, could you address that in
Sure.
In the context of the decrease of the proxy rate? from 65 to 55%
Right.
that's proposed in SHRED.
Well, the proxy was put in place in 2002 to simplify things, and as the Canadian Manufacturers Association has indicated, it's really to reduce audit angst. The Canada Revenue Agency, when they get a claim that uses traditional overhead, they have a real problem with it because it can be neither proven nor disproven, so it causes a lot of angst between taxpayers. So in an attempt to avoid that is why the proxy method came in. As an organization, as a company, for instance, I heard the testimony on Thursday where it indicated that too many people are using the proxy. Well, and it's because it's too generous. Well, that's not what we find at all. We actually have an internal policy that the traditional has to exceed the benefit from proxy by a very significant amount before we will even use traditional overhead because of the audit problems that occur.
Just really quick, is it fair to say that jobs in the oil and gas industry in Canada will be at risk because of cuts to SHRED?
Absolutely. I can tell you that one of our major clients, the difference in the projected R&D in the next year is very, very significant. How much is related to this? I think it's a lot, but it's also affected by other world factors as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Adler, please.
Well, thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here today. Mr. Turnbull, I just want to give you an opportunity to finish your thoughts on the question that Ms. McLeod had.
The microphone's for you.
Sure.
So none of
Okay,
you have
sorry.
to touch.
Yeah, I think I was almost finished in response to the last question. These amendments are quite related to the efforts to make sure that a financial crisis like the one that occurred in 2008 does not happen again, at least one that's propagated by the derivatives market.
Okay. Mr. Turnbull, I was very interested in your remarks and followed them very closely. And there's one thing we learned out of the recent financial crisis is that we need to pay more attention to the stability of the financial system. And I know you addressed that during the course of your remarks. I just want to ask you, the systematic risk, of course, can manifest itself in many different ways. Could you discuss some of those ways that it can be manifested?
Well, systemic risk is the risk to the financial system that is caused by some kind of a contagion passed among financial institutions.
With one institution, right? And the contagion begins to spread and amplify itself. Yeah.
That's correct. It can start with one institution and then spread throughout the financial system, such as the case with Lehman Brothers and the major insolvencies of the U.S. investment banks. It can also start in these major clearing systems because the clearing systems really act as funnels where unbelievable amounts of money are funneled and cleared through the system and money and assets every day. And if those systems are not sufficiently protected from risk and they fail, then that's another form of systemic risk that will cascade through the system.
Would you say that the financial system is too pro-cyclical, in your estimation?
That's not a question I can. It's really not in the purview of these amendments, so I'm really not in a position to respond to that.
Okay. Could you discuss then how important it is that now these amendments, of course, you mentioned came out of Pittsburgh, the G20, 2009, but the bank has been working on these and researching this for about 10 years now, and has been one of the forefronts of one of the central banks in terms of being in the forefront of examining systemic risk. Could you give us in detail how specifically these amendments that we have before us here in Bill C-45 will minimize or mitigate the risk or the opportunity for financial risk in the OTC?
These amendments, I'm not going to look at each particular amendment, but generally what these amendments are designed to do are to close the gaps in the legal protections that clearing and settlement systems have, and specifically these newer types of clearing and settlement systems called derivative CCPs, to close the gaps in the legal protections for those systems. And what we're talking about when we say legal protections is protections against the risk that if a major participant defaults in a system, that the system operator, the clearinghouse, the CCP, could be unable to exercise its remedies under the rules of the system because of stays or unwinding of payments that have already been settled in the system.
1 minute. Could you just talk a bit about what numerical indicators are used to determine whether there is an initial shock within the system, and what the threshold is to determine whether that's going to lead to a contagion or not?
I can't. Again, I'm legal counsel at the bank. I'm not in a position to discuss that kind of analysis.
Okay. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Adler. Mr. Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much. I'd like to address a question to Mr. Lavoie, along the same lines as Ms. Nash's questions. You mentioned that based on your analysis, the cost for businesses of the change in the shred crust tax credit would be about $660 million. Now, I'm asking this question because we had departmental officials here, and I compared your figures to theirs, and they're talking about $500 million. Now, why is there a difference between the two? Well, the difference is that they're calculating the impact of those revenues on government revenues, whereas we're talking about business income or business revenues. With large companies, because it's not refundable, if they're not profitable, they can't put it on their books for 1, 2, 3, 10, or even up to 20 years. So if a company does that, it has no impact on government revenues that year, and that's how they calculate it. Just because the company doesn't apply for it that year, the same year that it made the expenditure, does not make it an incentive. So, I mean, you can play with the methodology. So they're basing themselves on government revenues. So we're talking about $660 million that will not be available in terms of incentives. Those tax credits are administered by CRA. So changes to the federal system will automatically affect the provincial systems. So we're talking about another $84 million in incentives that are going to disappear, which gives us a total of $750 million. The loss of incentives for your clients and your businesses, I mean, what would the impact be on Canada in general, this loss of R&D tax credits? Well, I don't know how we can deal with that without resolving the original problem. They're spending more in R&D compared to GDP, the GDP of our country compared to other countries. Now, people are not putting enough money aside for their pensions or for their retirement, so we're going to eliminate their ability to do so. So there's not much point in doing this for a company in Connecticut and saying what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Well, you know, there'll be money at some point. The reason I'm asking the question is because when we had departmental officials here, they said it would have no significant impact on incentives, business incentives. Well, it's funny, but in 2007, a report was produced on the SHRED program, and they said in that report that every dollar spent through SR&ED had an economic impact of 11 cents per dollar. So now to say that it has no impact on incentives, I hear people saying that SR&ED doesn't work very well. But on page 8 of its report, the Finance Department says the opposite. I don't know whether you could also answer this after Mr. Lavoie. We're also talking about capital, the exclusion of capital expenditures in terms of the SR&ED. What is the impact of that? First, Mr. Lavoie. Well, as I said, capital expenditures are higher in our sector than they are elsewhere. For example, labor costs. And it is our belief that of the $750 million that's going to be taken away, capital will be about $123 million. So $95 million at the federal level and 28 at the provincial level. And
CCPCs that form part of our knowledge base indicates it's between 5 and 8%. Different industry than the manufacturing group, though.
Mr. Van Kesteren, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming here. Mr. Lavoie, I just want to get a clarification. And I apologize. Did you say that the primary focus of your group is the SR&ED issue? Is that the first and foremost?
In the bill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I've had a number of meetings with your organization. As a matter of fact, I had a meeting with 4 of your associates, and that I got to say that really wasn't brought up. I mean, I understand that is an area of concern, but for instance, it's been mentioned that the lack of SR&ED will have an enormous impact, and I'm sure Mr. Jean will deal on that in the oil sands. But most of our testimony has been that isn't the biggest issue. The biggest issue is workers. That there's an incredible lack, and that isn't just from the organizations that we heard from in the pipelines and in the oil extraction and all those, but also with the colleges. I'm looking for my quote here, but I know that the Canadian Association of Community Colleges has said that attracting skilled workers will be our greatest challenge. The other thing that we heard from your organization was ACCA, the accelerated cost allowance was paramount and seemed to have a great impact for success in your industry. I could go on. There's more. I was just looking for some more quotes, but overall, and I think we heard mention too about the red tape reduction. And I know again the Act doesn't just deal with that, but those have been the measures that our government has been most active in pursuing. And I have found that your organization has been most supportive of that. And although SR&ED is an issue and it is something we're struggling with, it wasn't the primary. Can you just maybe elaborate on that discrepancy?
It happens that SR&ED is part of that particular bill. I think to relate to the accelerated capital cost allowance, for example, I think that is going to be more an issue for the next budget, since the temporary extension of the measure will end up at the end of next year. So either it's renewed, made permanent, or completely eliminated in next year's budget. And that was part of our pre-budget submission that was presented by Jay Myers here, I think 2 weeks ago, during the pre-budget consultation.
When I visited, I made mention to that we had a number of your organizations represented in my office. For instance, the forestry people were greatly excited about what was happening with the opening of new markets, and how that has had an enormous impact on the forestry industry. Our government has amplified that and seen that as something that, again, is paramount to trade. do you want to comment on that? Are you hearing that as well from your organization? I picked forestry, but of course I could probably go to a number of different organizations. There was a gentleman there from Siemens, for instance, and I forget which function or what side of that was, but one of his concerns was the lack of protection that we have in investments in China. And of course, we've just had a bill passed that would protect those companies. Would you maybe just comment on those?
Our general position on trade agreements is that we're in favor in principle, but there has to be a level playing field. So if we do sign trade agreements with other countries, we hope that, for example, we're going to have the same access to their government procurements, then they will have access to our own government procurements, that the rules governing foreign direct investment will be similar, and that this is where the devil's in the details. So in principle, we're quite supportive of the government's aggressive agenda on trade, if that's the answer you're looking for.
Yeah, just very quickly. And again, I'm not saying that this isn't an area, and I've mentioned that shred is very important, but most of the testimony that we've had, if not all, have centered on other areas. And I'm just a little bit curious why suddenly this seems to be the focus of your organization.
Well, again, that was in the context of Bill C-45, and I would be happy to circulate to the committee. I do have a compiled testimonies from companies across the country who gave me their comments about how shred changes will impact their R&D and their business. I'll be happy to circulate that to the committee members.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Van Kesteren. Monsieur Mai, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Cudmore, I read from the website of TSGI, Chartered Accountant, say our interpretation of Bill C-45 reveals that taxpayers would now be eligible to claim only 80% of their payments to approved university, colleges, research institutes, or other similar institutions for conducting research and development on their behalf. This change was not highlighted at the time of the budget announcement and would seem to be counter to the government's emphasis on increasing collaboration between industry and academia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you expand more on that one?
Well, when the budget speech came out, it seemed to indicate that they were dealing only with where someone was using a third-party contractor, so they went out and hired XYZ engineering company to do part of their shred program. And then when the Bill C-45 came in, they used the wording to actually capture other parts besides third-party contractors, the normal contractors who the purpose that the budget speech said it was there for was to get rid of a profit margin, which we can all dispute whether or not even that was necessary. But why would they want to put universities in there? If there's any group that does not make a profit, we're all supporting universities in many different ways. I don't understand why that would have been included in Bill C-45.
We're wondering also a lot of things regarding that. Regarding shred, we've heard from the other side that changes to the shred here tax credit would actually either reduce red tape or things like that. Have those changes really affected red tape reduction?
You're asking good questions. The government has tried diligently for a decade or more to try to reduce complexity and lack of predictability in the shred program. And as other people have alluded to here, that continues to be the swan song that continues. It is very, very difficult to do that. None of the measures that the government is proposing to introduce will actually do anything other than make it more complex and more expensive for taxpayers. And will force some taxpayers not to want to even apply under the program, because the more complex anything is, the less likely they are to do it.
Monsieur Lavoie, est-ce que vous voyez aussi la même...
Mr. Lavoie, do you see the same reaction in the people that you represent? Yes. The complexity of the program, and from the point of view of our members as well, we're asked with the interpretation of the technological assessments and also the direction that the CRA has taken over the past 2 or 3 years. There was a rise in their success rate of claims, and now what we're faced with is a situation where they say, the CRA says, no, that's no longer eligible. And I think it just has to be made too simple. Well, just to come back to my question, are you saying that there are people who were entitled to the credit before are no longer entitled? I'd like to say a lot more about this, but I don't have a great deal of time.
CRA, when we ask questions to the officials with respect to negotiations, can you tell us what the impact would be to go through the President of the Treasury Board having to accept the mandate, and how does that work in terms of labor relations?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
That's good. Thank you. Thank you for the question, actually, and I'll speak from personal experience because I've sat on 5 bargaining teams with PSAC across the table from CRA. And since 1999, since the inception of the agency, the labor relations have been, steadily increasing in a very good way. To the point where we come to the bargaining table with the agency, we know that we're negotiating with the Treasury, with the agency, and not some, faceless, nameless person down the street. When we sit across from the representatives from the agency, that bodes very well in respect to, number one, the trust, and as well then the union management relations that we take away from that. As I said, the last 2 rounds of bargaining in 2007 and 2010, we reached tentative agreements prior to the expiration of that current agreement, and that's hardly ever seen. It was the first in the federal public service and hasn't been seen since. And unfortunately, what's happening now, what's going to happen, is that the staff relations, the union management relations in the agency are going to deteriorate for sure.
Well, the only excuse the reason we had was to make CRA compliance with the other organizations. Does that really help? Is that really a good excuse in terms of maybe affecting the...
Just a brief response.
It makes absolutely no sense when in 1999 it said that they wanted to create a separate agency to get away from Treasury Board and to entice as well new acquisition of business for CRA. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And thank you, witnesses, for attending today. I'm very interested in talking a little bit more about SHRED. I have done some research online, and I actually have come across some people that indicate that they are experts at SHRED. R&D partners, for instance, say that they have a reputation and track record, leading Canadian independent R&D tax advisor that has been in business for over 10 years, successfully filed over 1,000 projects and $100 million in R&D tax credits, comprehensive and thorough understanding of the current R&D tax rulings, excellent relationship with federal and provincial tax authorities across Canada. Are you individuals familiar with this particular company, R&D Partners? R&D Partners. R&D Partners. Okay, it's on the website. It's one of the first 3 hits that come up. I just wonder, they seem to indicate that they have an excellent track record. They have successfully filed over 1,000 projects and $100 million in R&D tax credits. So it seems to me that there are experts out there that seem to know what they're doing. I am not one of those people. But I just want to confirm at this stage that my understanding is, as far as the changes to the SHRED program, that the total pot of money is going to remain the same. In fact, my further understanding is that some of your groups have lobbied for more direct funding before and less SHRED credits. Is that fair to say, Mr. Lavoie? More money going direct to direct funding? Because my understanding is any savings from the SHRED program, it's not going to be going back into general revenues. It's going to actually be used to directly fund initiatives that SHRED would have gone for. Isn't that fair to say? So the money is not being reduced.
I think we've never been against more direct support mechanisms, but we've never advocated that any money into new direct support should be taken out of SHRED.
And I'm not saying that. In fact, the exact opposite. They're not taking money out of SHRED. They're actually taking it, any savings that are there are still going to be used for that program. Are you familiar with that? You're not aware of any tax cuts?
It's not going to be reused for SHRED. It's going
to direct funding for these organizations.
Direct funding.
Yes.
What is it? I don't know. I couldn't tell. Okay. I don't know.
Well, my understanding is there's not going to be any cuts under the program. There might be some savings, but those savings will be redirected into direct funding for those projects. Now, I'm just curious. You mentioned that that this is one of the most important things for oil and gas industry, and I don't know if the government of Canada hands out $50 million a day, but right now Canada and the oil and gas industry for oil itself, because of the distribution struggle we have with our networks, are losing somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million in direct profit per day on our oil industry. Are you familiar with that? Okay.
this gentleman is.
Are you familiar with that, sir?
I don't know those numbers.
Okay, well, you understand.
But I understand that
there's a 40% tax
the
discount to the
differential
Americans. It's about $50 million a day.
They're getting
so,
a great deal.
Yeah, they're getting a discount, a great deal, a $50 million deal a day.
We've got to change it.
Which is going to be $100 million in about 15 years. Are you aware of that?
No.
Okay, doesn't that seem like a much more pressing issue than the SR&ED tax credit?
I think all of these issues.
I agree, but I mean, would you not suggest that is a much more important issue to deal with? I'm not saying that we shouldn't deal with SR&ED. I'm just suggesting that this is a much higher on the priority list.
It's a very important issue, but I also think the SR&ED is very important.
It's not, sir. Yeah. But you have your organizations and Mr. Lavoie's organizations have been asking for simplicity, for predictability, that it's far too complicated, and this government's set forward a task force to actually recommend changes to do exactly what your organizations are asking for. Fair enough?
Yes, they have.
Okay. And in fact, one of the particular proposals is by to move to more simplistic method by removing the eligibility of capital from the base of eligible expenditures, which is the most complex component of it.
I would thoroughly disagree with that.
Could you tell me why?
We as a firm have never had a problem with CRA on capital expenditures. I don't know where that came from.
Are you familiar with the task force and what their recommendations were and what their findings were?
The Jenkins report?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and you didn't see that they suggested that the eligibility of capital was the most complicated part of it?
That was their opinion, but it is not in practice what we see.
Okay.
And we see claims of up to $100 million of expenditures. So,
but it's fair to say that's what they came up with.
Yes.
And also the cost effectiveness of the program is going to be improved through a number of actions. For instance, the SR&ED overhead expenditures will be reduced from 65% to 55% of the salaries and wages of employees. That's correct. I see you nodding your head, Mr. Lavoie. And in fact, the profit element will be removed for arm's length third-party contracts for the purpose of calculation of SR&ED tax credits. Correct? And you're nodding again, Mr. Lavoie. And finally, the general SR&ED investment tax credit will be reduced to 15% from 20%. That's correct. So there are some measures that have been moved. In fact, the predictability of SR&ED program will also be enhanced with some things that I don't have time to talk about today, but you're obviously familiar with some of those. Wouldn't you suggest that the government is moving in the right direction to find those, to find some and move forward with the initiatives that you're asking for?
As it relates to capital expenditure, when we saw that in the report, I actually read about 45 submissions to the Jenkins panel. I didn't find one that said that capital expenditure was too complex, and I know finance has said that. I never heard it once among our membership. And I
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
In the budget?
Thank you, Mr. Jean. Mr. Marston, please.
Well, it teaches me to be using this particular program here that I get a little bit ahead of myself. Mr. Alwood, the changes that are taking place to your pensions of your members, in the provisions for that change, there's a part that talks about retroactivity. And what I'm concerned about here, and I'm wondering if you share those concerns, is what does that actually entail for existing employees?
That's a very good question, Mr. Marston. I have with me another witness who is a subject matter expert on pensions, and I would ask Mr. Infantino if he would come and answer that question specifically. Mr. Chair.
Take your spot.
Well, thank you for that question, Mr. Marston. I think actually what you were referring to was part of the provisions regarding the establishment of a two-tier arrangement, exactly. and how there will be two groups of employees, one group of existing employees who will remain under the terms of the plan as they exist now, and then a new set of group of employees who will continue on a go-forward basis in terms of new eligibility requirements for pension. I believe that's what you're speaking to in terms of retroactivity about how that will apply.
Yeah.
Okay, that's my understanding of the language and the legislation under this particular part of Bill C-45.
Well, from our or at least the official opposition's concerns is the impact that'll have on young people. I mean, people coming in, because they're facing two-tier pensions. It won't be long before they're facing two-tier wages, I would suspect, sir.
That's correct. It wasn't too long ago that we used to pay women differently for exactly the same work. And like I say, that seems to be a direction that perhaps we're going down with respect to this in terms of young people.
Well, in terms of young people and the crippling debt that they're coming to university with now, I've already got significant concerns there. That's really all I have on pensions. Mr.
Thank you.
Turnbull,
Thank you.
Turning to you for a second, sir. When you were referencing derivatives in 2008, I am far from any expert on on that situation, but it struck me that the catastrophe that happened down in the States is, for some, it was kind of a freewheeling attitude going on down there, where they were bundling derivatives where they knew the mortgages were not good. They knew in back of all of this. Canada did very well during that time. Was that because we weren't invested in derivatives, or what was the reason?
Well, my understanding is that as you suggested, the large Canadian market players did not get into the derivatives market to the extent that their European and American counterparts did. They did dabble in it, but they tended to stick more to basic banking and investment vehicles.
In a less polite way, I think they weren't as greedy as some of their counterparts down in the States, and didn't take the risk as a result. The changes in C45 in this regard then are probably something worthwhile. It wasn't that we had such great protection before, it was that we were lucky in a lot of senses of the word. So now we do need the provisional changes that we see in there, from your perspective.
That's right. These are really changes to sort of the financial plumbing or the financial infrastructure to ensure that if we get into trouble in the future with institutions going into default and this kind of contagion effect, that the clearing systems that are designed to add stability to the system will hold up in these situations, because those are really the facilities that we're depending on to control risk, so that these types of things don't happen in the future.
Okay, about 1 minute.
Coming back to you, sir, since you're back at the table, the number of your members that are losing their jobs, I understand that's in the 40,000 range. Is that a correct figure or close?
Not quite. Not for PSAC members. PSAC members, it's closer to 20,000.
Across government services, I understand it's about 40,000. Do you have any estimates about the ripple effect of that? Because every job that you have, a good-paying job, is having an effect on our economy. Mm-hmm. And it's like the automobile manufacturing. They believe that for every job in auto, there's 5 to 7 jobs created around. Do you have any estimate on that figure and what that loss would be?
We know that in small-town Canada, it's going to have a devastating effect. In places like Montague, Prince Edward Island, St. Andrews, New Brunswick, where there's a loss of federal jobs, we engaged with the province of PEI on the loss of federal jobs, with the provincial government and the municipality of Charlottetown. They are very concerned about the effect that the federal job loss will have. And we know across the country, Canadians are telling us, I mean, we're talking to people like coffee shop owners and bike store owners that say, I'm going to be out of a job because the money is going to be going out of the community. So every federal job that's lost, especially in small town Canada, has that trickle-down effect, so that, like I said, the small business person in those communities are going to be faced with a loss of business, and therefore a possible loss of business, a loss of their own business.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marston. Ms. Glover, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to the witnesses again. I'm going to start by asking about a few measures we haven't talked about that are in C45, because I think it's important that we get your input on those as well. So I'll start with Mr. Lavoie. You and I have had an opportunity to talk about some of the things our government has done in the past in the hopes of creating jobs and helping businesses, things like the decrease in the GST, the corporate tax decreases, limiting the EI premium to 5 cents instead of the 15 cents, not opting for doubling of CPP as proposed by the NDP, not going to a 45-day work year that would cost businesses. And for the most part, I know that your organization was very supportive of those measures to help your businesses, so I appreciate that. And I see you nodding. Hopefully that means that that's still the case. But in this bill, there are a couple of measures I haven't heard you on, so I'd like to give you an opportunity. And the accelerated capital cost allowance for clean energy, generation equipment. I'm wondering if you can tell us how that investment would help your businesses. Is it a good measure in C45?
We're quite supportive of accelerated capital cost allowance. We see it as a great tax incentive for making companies invest more in what we call productive assets, in this case, clean energy assets. And we think that should be applied to any kind of machinery and equipment used for manufacturing. And as it relates to the SR&ED tax credit, why not any piece of equipment that is used mostly for R&D purpose?
Mm-hmm. And there's also the hiring credit for small business that's in this bill. So I'd be interested in knowing if that's going to help your businesses, if you think that's a good measure that we ought to continue with.
Are you talking about the $1,000 rebate?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, in an ideal world, I think you will hear us and CFIB and others say that we would like a freeze in the premiums. But in the current context, I think, as you mentioned, the 5-cent increase instead of 15.7 instead of 21 for employers is reasonable. And I know that for CFIB we'll have better numbers about this. I know that for some companies that are near the $10,000, they won't have access to the rebate. For some of them, I don't know how big it is, but it's mostly for small companies, and I'm sure CFIB will talk about that.
And actually, we had officials in. I was quite surprised to hear that 534,000 companies took advantage of the hiring credit that was in place before, and so we're extending that. It saved them about $205 million that they were able to obviously reinvest in other places, whether it be R&D or innovation or anything else. I mean, it's up to them, but it's money saved for sure. And then the PRPP measures. There was a lot of discussion when the PRPP bill first went forward, and now that we're trying to finish up with the PRPPs, have your companies voiced an opinion on that? Do you have any stories to tell about whether they think that's a great measure or not?
I don't have particular stories, but I did hear some of our members said that they were looking at that as a good alternative. Of course, I would say that the major issues we do have with pension funds is more related to the pension fund insolvency issues, and some of it has to do with the provincial level more than the federal level. But yeah, it's nothing. I haven't heard anything against that measure for sure.
Okay, excellent. And I might do the same thing with Madame Presso and Monsieur. I'm sorry, I can't see your name, but our wonderful general accountant at the end of the table, TSGI, I think it is. The Registered Disability Savings Plan changes that are in Bill C-45. If you can tell us, you think these are good measures? Are they important to families? Will these help families?
Thank you for your question. Absolutely. We think the RDSP is excellent. We've participated in the consultations leading up to the proposals included in Budget 2012. And absolutely on the surface, we think this is a very positive impact. We would have, of course, we'd like to see things to go a bit further. And we had to recommend, for example, rollover options for RSPs. Right now, our rollover options are just for RESPs. And we've also heard back from some of our members who serve that community very well that as constructed now, the RDSP does pose some challenges. Well, it's inaccessible, I would say, for those individuals who become more disabled at an older age in life. For example, those that are attain the MS or MD, multiple muscular dystrophy, would not be helpful. But on the surface, yes, it's a good step.
That's good feedback. I appreciate that, and we'll take that into consideration for future. Did you have any comments about the RDSP changes? Do you think those will benefit clients that you might?
No, I don't have any comments on that.
No? Okay, and that's fine. Well, let me just ask then, if I could, Madame Presso, we've met before on tax measures and how important it was for this government to address tax loopholes, those kinds of things. In the bill, we address tax loopholes. Any comments about the tax loopholes changes we're making?
Well, there's a number of measures addressed. I'd like to address the gaps that are the pieces of legislation that are not in the bill. Really, that's what we've been looking at as the gray areas. Those have not been legislated, and we'll welcome the typical tax bill when it comes forward. I think that's going to be an important one. The Auditor General talked about 400 unlegislated tax measures. We still have to address that backlog.
The Ways and Means would take.
Yes, we've taken notice that the Ways and Means motion has been tabled. I do want to say something about the pool, the PRPPs. If you have very briefly, we do support the introduction. it's going to start filling that big, wide gap that there is between public and private pension plans, but certainly we are supportive of PRPPs. Now we have to get provinces adopt the legislation, and we have to get employers choosing and offering PRPPs as well.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Glover. I'm going to finish with the final round. I just wanted to, perhaps I'll follow up with Mr. Cudmore. In your opening statement, you talk about you've worked with the NRC IRAP program. Do you see that as a good federal program, the IRAP program?
Yes, the IRAP program is a wonderful program. It's one of the best ones that I've seen with the National Research Council. It's unfortunate that they don't have more funding than they do.
Now, the funding that was announced in Budget 2012, I assume you see that as a welcome investment in terms of the budgetary funding?
I see that as a what?
Do you see that as welcome in terms of the funding increase by Budget 2012?
Yes, that is a very good thing to happen. I think that the IRAP program, of course, only helps small and medium-sized corporations, not large ones. But it's very, very positive, yes.
Okay. And Mr. Lavoie, would you agree that the NRC IRAP program is a good program?
Yeah, we do agree. And same thing. It's not accessible for companies with more than 500 employees, but it's good for what it's designed to do.
I mean, it's certainly what I hear universally from businesses. Now, I just want to read you a couple of statements from actually the budget document. It says, relative to peer countries, Canada has an over-reliance on tax incentives in the mix of federal support for business research and development compared to direct expenditures to support innovative firms and public-private research collaborations. Therefore, key recommendations of the Jenkins report shift resources from indirect support through the SHRED tax incentive program to direct forms of support, including the Industrial Research Assistance Program. And then obviously Economic Action Plan 2012 begins to deliver on this commitment, announcing $1.1 billion over 5 years for direct research and development support and making available $500 million for venture capital. So the logic here is fairly clear, is that we have a program, the single largest federal program supporting business R&D in Canada is a SHRED program, provided over $3.6 billion taxpayer funds in 2011. But the rationale is to move some of that taxpayer support to more direct funding like programs like IRAP. And as both of you gentlemen know, governments have to make decisions in terms of opportunity cost. We can't fund everything. We can't just simply, money doesn't grow on trees and on it. We have to make decisions. So the decision was made to move some of that very generous support, taxpayer support for R&D, from the indirect support like SHRED into direct programs like IRAP. So do you disagree with that overall approach, or do you agree with that? Or if so, just sort of give me your reaction as an organization and as an individual. I'll start with Mr. Cudmore and then Mr. Lavoie.
I think another report that should be looked at is the McIntosh report. Professor Jeffrey McIntosh, who wrote in March of this year in commentary to the Jenkins report. And one of the things that he talked about was whether or not direct investment was really the way to go. And his studies would indicate that even very sophisticated investors have a very difficult time in getting it right and picking the right winners. So whenever the government plays the position of making direct investments, they are an investor, and I don't think we have much hope of them ever making as good a decisions as the market will make.
Your view is, of the two choices, then you would keep the funding with SHRED and not increase funding for IRAP.
Okay, the IRAP,
you can't do both. Right?
The IRAP funding that you did was only $115 million of new money. That's very little of the $1.5 billion you took apart.
Over $1 billion of funding plus $500 million for venture capital.
And I think we have to see whether or not that's whether that's an effective way of dealing with it. Again, you're asking the government to be an investor, and they have never proven themselves to be a particularly adept investor in any type of private enterprise.
Okay, Mr. Lavoie.
First observation is that it is true that there is maybe a greater imbalance between direct and indirect support in Canada. What I don't have is evidence that a more balanced approach would necessarily have more business R&D expenditures in Canada. My second observation is that part of this imbalance was actually created in 2006 when we got rid of a program called Technology Partnership Canada, which was providing $350 million a year into our direct R&D support. There's been a lot of problems with this program, including the picking winners issue, including the Auditor General has made several reports about it, and we decided to get rid of it. That part of this imbalance was treated right there. We kept some of it under CD, but still, there's still a gap. So I want to be cautious here because there's going to be 2,600 companies impacted by the ITC rate reduction, and I don't think any direct support mechanism is going to be accessible for these 2,600 companies.
My time is running out here, but so the $3.6 billion of taxpayer assistance in 2011, you mentioned you're going to submit a list of companies and their concerns in terms of funding they may lose. Could we have as a committee a list of all innovations that have occurred as a result of this very large federal taxpayer investment?
Members?
Yes. And say, Mr. Cudmore, if you have any information the committee could consider. Because of that big, broad public policy debate, I mean, we as parliamentarians have to justify to taxpayers, including the Taxpayers Federations in the room right now, $3.6 billion is an awful lot of taxpayer money. And the Jenkins panel came out with a specific report, which you two disagree with. But then you have to argue your case with very specific examples in terms of what types of innovations have actually happened as a result of business investment, as a result of the SHRED program. So I'd like that information from both of you if I could ask for it. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, responding to our questions, your presentations. If you have anything further, please submit it to the clerk. We'll ensure all members get it. And colleagues, we will suspend for a few minutes and come back with a second panel. Thank you. I call this meeting back to order, the 89th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance, continuing our study of Bill C-45, a second act to implement certain provisions of the budget, tabled in Parliament on March 29, 2012. For our second panel here this afternoon on the bill, I would like to welcome four individuals. First of all, representing the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Ms. Corinne Pullman. Welcome to the committee. We have also a second organization, the Canadian Labour Congress. We have Ms. Angela McEwen. Welcome to the committee. We have Mr. Gregory Thomas from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Welcome. And we are expecting Mr. Albert DeLuca, partner with Deloitte & Touche. You each have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and we'll start with the CFIB, and then we'll have questions at the end of the last statement.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. CFIB is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization representing more than 109,000 small and medium-sized businesses across Canada who collectively employ more than 1.25 million Canadians and account for $75 billion in GDP. Our members represent all sectors of the economy and are found in every region of the country. The focus of my remarks will be on three provisions of Bill C-45 that are important to small business owners. They are the EI hiring credit, pooled registered pension plans, and changes to public sector pensions. And I should have a slide deck like this in front of you that I'd like to walk you through over the next few minutes, even though you're eating at the moment. Measures that address barriers to small business growth are very important, as they more than anything will help Canada's overall economy and job creation. As you can see on slide 2, payroll taxes have by far the greatest impact on growth. Why? Because they are a tax on jobs. It must be paid regardless of any profit. This is why EI remains a key issue for us and is why we continue to push for the extension and expansion of the EI hiring credit for as long as EI rates continue to go up, as they did in 2012 and will again in 2013. Very recently, we asked specifically about the EI hiring credit and found that almost 2/3 said it was somewhat or very effective in helping to
Ms. Pullman, I'm told that translators
slow
are having
down.
time keeping up, so
To
I think it's, yeah. Well, and if any of you have an opening presentation we could give to them, that would help as well.
I did provide a presentation
Oh, you
to
did?
them.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, they should have it there. So on slide 3, you will see that the hiring credit was actually seen by 64% as being somewhat or very effective in helping them to maintain or strengthen business performance. It does this by offsetting at least some of the EI premium increases when businesses grow their payroll. And this is especially important for smaller firms who tend to be more sensitive to these kinds of cost increases. So while small businesses would prefer to see EI premium rates frozen, the EI hiring credit does provide some relief to the smallest firms. However, I do want to mention we do have some concerns with the suspension of the Canada Employment Insurance Financing Act and the dissolution of the board. Now, we understand and support the need to cut costs, and it makes sense to suspend the board's operations while it has nothing to do. However, our interest has always been that there be an EI count independent and separate of general government revenues, so that their surpluses that accumulated in the past to the tune of $57 billion could never again be spent on government's priorities. On other government priorities. So while we understand the practicality of suspending the board's operations, we insist that EI continue to be treated as an account separate from general revenues. The next part of Bill C-45 that is of interest to small business relates to provisions of the bill to help create pooled registered pension plans. This is important as the majority of small business owners don't have a retirement plan for themselves or their employees, as you see on slide 4. Why? As you can see on slide 5, most small business owners will tell you that having a retirement savings plan is too expensive and too complicated to administer. Now, we believe that PRPPs will start to address some of those issues, as you can see on slide 6. We recently asked small businesses about those features they would find most attractive in a PRPP and found that giving employers a choice, keeping costs low, having no payroll taxes on the employer contributions, and minimizing the paperwork were all equally important. So in theory, with this framework in place, PRPPs should address these issues to some degree. However, it will be up to the provinces and financial institutions to make it attractive to small firms. The good news is that just over 1/3 would consider offering a PRPP, as you can see on slide 7, and another 30% may become interested once they have more information. Offering more options for retirement planning is welcomed by CFIB and our members. The last provisions of Bill C-45 that I want to focus on are changes to public sector pensions. We welcome these changes as they start to address some of the unfairness and unsustainability of public sector pensions. Let me illustrate why this is a concern for small business owners. On slide 8, you can see that more than half, 58% of small business owners said that they did not feel that they have sufficient disposable income to take advantage of the various retirement savings options available to them. Furthermore, more than half do not believe that they will be able to retire comfortably until they are well past the age of 65, as you can see on slide 9. Contrast this with the fact that in the last 5 years, 9 out of 10 new federal public sector pensioners retired before the age of 65 with guaranteed retirement incomes, much of which is being paid for by these very same taxpayers who cannot afford to put money towards their own retirement, partly because they have to pay taxes to help pay for these government pensions. Last year, CFB launched a pension campaign calling for greater transparency of public sector pension liabilities and fairness for taxpayers. Over the last year, we have collected over 55,000 action alerts from small business owners concerned about the state of Canada's public sector pension system, and many of you have likely received these in your office. These small business owners are particularly concerned with the sustainability of the federal pension plan and has an unfunded liability estimated to be somewhere between $140 and $220 billion. So we're pleased to see that Bill C-45 will start to address these issues by gradually moving federal public sector workers to a 50-50 split in contributions from their current 37% share, which will also bring the federal public service more in line with most of its provincial counterparts. This measure was well supported by small business owners, as you can see on slide 10. We also support the provision of Bill C-45 that will move the retirement age to 65 for new employees as of 2013. Many other organizations, including federal agencies like the EDC and Bank of Canada, have also made changes to address their pension issues by providing a different type of pension plan to new employees that include increasing retirement age to 65. It's good to see this federal public sector is also moving in this direction. We believe that these provisions are a good start in addressing some of these issues. So all the provisions I've outlined on slide 11 and discussed here are important to small business. As such, we would want to see them implemented as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We'll now hear from the Canadian Labour Congress, please.
Thank you. On behalf of the 3.3 million members of the Canadian Labour Congress, we want to thank you for this opportunity to present our views regarding the 2012 Federal Budget Implementation Bill. The CLC brings together workers from virtually all sectors of the Canadian economy, in all occupations, and in all parts of Canada. Bill C-45, Part 22, proposes to temporarily suspend the Canadian Employment Insurance Financing Board. The suspension of the CEIFB makes sense, as it was constrained in setting rates by subsection 66(7) of the EI Act, which limited rate increases or decreases to 5.05% of insurable earnings. But in fact, the CLC never agreed with the CEIFB as it was established, as it failed to include input from premium payers who are employees and employers. And in past submissions to the government and to parliamentary committees, the CLC called for a separate employment insurance account governed by an EI commission or similar body established at arm's length from the federal government. Similar to the CFIB, we are concerned with the surplus that was taken. So we argued that the AI account and any surplus funds placed in a reserve fund or premium stabilization fund should be used only for EI purposes. The fact that the EI program is paid for by employer and worker premiums has not been adequately reflected in the governance of EI finances. If we consider the $57 billion that was taken from the account without the consent of premium payers, the account would actually be in a surplus position right now. The government would be less concerned with cutting back EI programming, and EI would be performing one of its key roles as an automatic economic stabilizer more effectively. When the CEIFB is reinstated, the premium payers, employees, and employers should have closer input into the premium setting process and effective joint control with the government over the management of any reserve funds and the use of any surpluses. As well, we want to comment on how the EI financing system now in place is not operating in an appropriately counter-cyclical way. Even though the federal government directly covered the cost of EI measures in Canada's Economic Action Plan, including the cost of the premium freeze during the recession, training benefits, work sharing, and the temporary 5-week extension of regular benefits, the EI operating account went into deficit because of the large increase in the cost of regular EI benefits. And that was caused by an increase in the national unemployment rate from about 6% before the recession to a high of 8.6% in 2009, and continuing high employment since the worst of the recession. It's been at about 7.4% for the past year. Premiums were frozen during the worst of the recession rather than reduced, and are now rising during a very weak recovery. While the premium revenue is forecast to exceed EI expenditures in 2012, it will have to continue to do that in order to pay off the deficit of $9.2 billion that was in the EI operating account at the end of 2011. And the stage is set for continuing premium increases for several years in order to eliminate the accumulated deficit. Again, this is the case notwithstanding the huge EI surplus, which was accumulated before the recession. We believe the federal government should pay into the segregated EI operating account an amount equal to deficits in the account incurred from 2009 until such time as the account is segregated, and should cover any future deficits incurred in the account until such time as the national unemployment rate falls below 6.5%. I would also like to speak to an unexpected tax change in Bill C-45. Bill C-45 clarifies the taxation of RCAs, closing an unintended loophole. At the same time, Bill C-45 extends pension splitting to RCAs. Budget 2012 states that under the Income Tax Act, a retirement compensation arrangement is a type of employer-sponsored funded retirement savings arrangement. RCAs are normally used to fund the portion of a higher income employee's pension benefit that exceeds the maximum pension benefit permitted under the RPP contribution limits. So this is effectively a tax break for wealthy seniors that will have very little benefit for most Canadians. Pension income splitting provisions do not benefit unattached seniors, who are 30% of all Canadians over the age of 65 and who are those most vulnerable to poverty. And there is no benefit to senior couples whose income is so low that they already pay no income tax. The amount of tax savings from pension income splitting depends on the income level, so that the small proportion of affluent seniors receive the largest reductions, with the majority of middle-income seniors seeing only a modest reduction, if any. This is especially true of allowing pension splitting on RCAs, into which many seniors will not have had the resources to contribute. As well, different types of pension splitting have different impacts. Allowing spousal RSPs encourages the higher earning spouse to actually transfer the funds into the control of the lower earning spouse. Allowing the splitting of pension income for tax purposes reduces the couple's tax burden in the current year, but does not require funds to actually be shared with the lower earning spouse. An example of where this might matter is in the case of subsequent divorce or the death of the higher earning spouse. Where pension splitting was encouraged via spousal RSPs, the lower earning spouse is far better off than in other forms of pension splitting. A thorough gender analysis of the budget and budget provisions, such as a GBA+, as outlined on the Status of Women's website, would illuminate the differential gender impact of such apparently gender-neutral policy decisions.
Okay, Ms. McEwen, if we could just ask you to conclude very briefly.
Sure. I just have one more paragraph. Pension splitting measures cost $3.2 billion in 2010 alone. We argue that these tax expenditures would be better directed at returning OAS to age 65 and improving GIS so that all seniors in Canada are above the poverty line. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. We'll now have for Mr. Thomas, please. Your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate the invitation of the committee to appear today. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is Canada's largest taxpayer advocacy group with over 70,000 supporters from coast to coast and 22 years of history advocating for less government, lower taxes, and more accountability from our elected officials. We welcome the reforms contained in Bill C-45 as they apply to public sector pensions. We believe that increasing the retirement age for new hires to 65
is a good first step towards making government employee pensions at the federal level more sustainable. And we salute members of all parties for taking leadership in reforming their own pensions and speeding that legislation to royal assent. It was a long multi-decade slog for us, and you folks managed to get the job done in 48 hours when the chips were down. So that was inspiring to watch. With regard to pensions, we note that the public sector pensions, if you look at C.D. Howe's estimates and you look at the public accounts, unlike the Canada Pension Plan, the government employees' pensions are completely funded out of general revenues, and there are no pension funds set aside to secure the retirements of Canada's federal government employees. We believe that Parliament really needs to have a serious look at this. Government was able to put the Canada Pension Plan on a sustainable basis, and with the reforms to old age security by raising the retirement age to 67 and giving people an incentive to stay in the workforce until age 70, you're also putting old age security benefits on a more sustainable basis as well. We think you need to look at this for government employees. With regard to EI, we have a lot of sympathy for the arguments of the Canadian Labour Congress when they rightfully feel that, to have $57 billion of employment insurance funds snafu'd by government to apply to the deficit reduction, is a shocking and upsetting development. And this seizing of these notional pension surpluses in the 1990s falls under the same banner. We think that parliamentarians, people with their feet on the ground who have to go home on the weekend and explain all this to their constituents, need to be very wary of actuarial assumptions and projections and notional surpluses and these deficits that arise, because the facts are, when you move away from having individuals save for their own retirements, innocent people are subject to the manipulations of government and the financial system, and it doesn't serve anyone. So with regard to the EI funding, we note that for every employee up to the average industrial wage now, employers and employees who are fully in the system pay over $2,000 combined into the EI fund each year. And, many people will never claim on the EI fund. And yet you have entire regions of the country where people are multiple claimants, claiming more than 3 times in the last 5 years. It's particularly unfair in the Ontario labour market, where it's very difficult for most people who are working to even qualify for EI. And we ask ourselves why you don't set up a plan similar to the Canada Pension Plan, where employees and employers contribute to a rainy day fund that individual workers can access directly. Thank you.
That's it. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas. We'll go to Mr. DeLuca, please, for your 5-minute opening presentation.
Thank you. Firstly, I apologize for not having a document handy, but I was invited to attend yesterday, and we do have a submission from Deloitte, which was filed on September 13th last, on the other hand. My opening remarks relate to the R&D incentives program. Particularly, I am the Canadian leader of the Global Incentives and Investment Attraction for Deloitte, and I also preside the board of the Quebec Industrial Research Association, LADRIC, and it's in this capacity that we're in contact with industry from right across the country, and wish to reflect the view and industry's view on changes proposed in relation to SHRED. We think we need to position the incentives discussion in the wider discussion of innovation, investment attraction, or preservation, and R&D incentives must certainly serve to help increase productivity. We would agree with that, but should also serve to increase economic wealth by creating the next generation of technologies. Canada is attracting natural resource investments, and unfortunately, the related innovation investment is not being made in Canada, or at least not entirely. And Canada is therefore not as attractive compared to the rest of the world in its strategy of attracting, preserving, or even creating the next large technology company. Canada's SHRED regime has been widely viewed as an important positive factor in encouraging innovation investment in Canada. We believe that the proposals to reduce government support of the program make Canada's incentive regime less attractive than those of competing countries who are improving their incentive programs. In fact, Canada's ranking in tax incentives generosity has already declined from 3rd to 5th for small companies, 9th to 13th for larger ones, from 2008 to 2012. With the changes announced in the budget, we anticipate that these rankings, especially for large companies, will drop even further. Our recent post-budget survey of Canadian companies confirms that reactions to the reduction in government support through the program, the SHRED program, have generally not been positive and suggest that Canada's R&D tax regime will be less attractive after the changes. In our view, the elimination of incentives for capital expenditures does not recognize that capital investments are needed to perform R&D, and that certain industries will be put at a disadvantage as a result of this measure. For example, the software industry, which requires computers and related equipment in order to undertake R&D. Rather than completely eliminating all capital costs, we recommend that the government distinguish between short-term capital expenditures, such as computers and related equipment, and longer-term ones, and treat the short-term capital expenditures in the same manner as material costs would be. In other words, eligible for SHRED credits. In addition, rather than introducing a broad elimination of eligibility of capital expenditures for SHRED, we recommend the introduction of a limitation process. For example, an approach similar to that for shared use equipment could be considered. Alternatively, the proposals could introduce a cap on the amount that would qualify. Should the proposals relating to capital expenditures be retained, we recommend that the draft legislation be refined to introduce greater certainty. I won't go through the series of notes in respect of the drafting itself, but there's a number of them which create some uncertainty as it relates to the legislation as currently drafted. As we had noted in our pre-budget 2012 submission of October 2011, we believe that Canada's R&D tax regime should be improved by allowing the tax credits to be at least partially refundable for all businesses, as is the case in many countries and in Canadian provinces. I note the UK, for example, which after 2 years of study has decided not to eliminate the program as they had initially considered, but rather make the tax credit entirely refundable for all companies. France as well. Expanding the refundable credit to all businesses would more appropriately reward risks inherent in carrying out SHRED in Canada, rather than applying credits only to profitable years when the credits are not as necessary. Long-term planning is made more difficult for many organizations, particularly those that operate in cyclical industries, and cannot easily predict when they will have sufficient corporate tax liability to benefit from the SHRED tax credit. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We will begin members' questions avec Monsieur Caron, s'il vous plaît.
Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to begin with Ms. Pullman. With respect to the tax credit for new hiring, we're talking about $2,000 per new hire through the EI program. This is an attractive addition, but we're also hearing that in 2011, 560 businesses took advantage of that tax credit. But where I have a problem is that we're talking about 530,000 jobs that were created, and when the department was here, we asked about the businesses that had taken advantage of the tax credit and whether they had kept these people on hire for a longer period, and the answer was no. Now, in terms of job creation, do you really think that of the 530,000 businesses that took advantage of it, all retained their employees for the rest of the year?
Say yes, they all did. Having said that, I do believe that The purpose of the credit is obviously to encourage businesses to hire new employees, but it's also to encourage them to maintain their employees, right? And that's just as important when you're going through a difficult time. And it's something that allows them to have at least something that they can perhaps make that decision to hold on to their employees a little bit longer. So I think that's the other important element behind why this credit, while small, is important to smaller companies.
Dans le programme du NPD aux dernières élections,
Now, in the last election, the NDP said it was in favor of a hiring tax credit, along with one that would be an incentive to retain employees. Don't you think that would be more effective in creating more permanent and stable jobs?
Again, though, it would depend on. It's really loud. Sorry about that. I think it certainly would be helpful to have something that would obviously encourage people to retain their employees, but at the same time, businesses have to go with the cycle. They have to understand what they need from time to time, and it's going to be not always easy for every single small firm to be able to hold on to every employee they bring on. Most of them we know. We always say small businesses are the first to hire and the last to fire, right? So they'll do anything they can to hold on to their people, and we saw that through the recession very clearly. So I think that type of incentive may also be helpful, but I think the EI hiring credit, the way it is now, has also been useful for a lot of the very small companies.
Merci. Monsieur Thomas, rapidement, on a parlé rapidement de la question des...
Mr. Thomas, can you speak very briefly about members' pensions? The only element that I would come back to is that the position of the NDP was that there should be an independent panel which would be able to to scrutinize not just the pensions but also the salaries. Do you think that this would be a good thing, that it would be positive for the better future of the House of Commons and all members of Parliament?
It is our long-standing position that parliamentarians need to continue to set their own salaries and make these decisions, because ultimately they are accountable for the decisions. We survey our members on a regular basis in this regard, and our supporters whom we survey consistently believe that parliamentarians should be accountable for their wages, their benefits, their budgets, and therefore they've historically been very resistant to the idea of getting any kind of expert commission to make.
Mon temps est limité. J'ai une dernière question pour Monsieur Deluca.
I have a last question for Mr. DeLuca. We've heard other consultants here say from the PSGI Chartered Accountants say, and also people from the Canadian Manufacturers Association say that spoke to us about SHRED and the Jenkins report. There have been problems that have arisen in the Jenkins report. So what, to your mind, is the principal error that was inherent in the Jenkins report? The Jenkins Committee did considerable work to better understand the impact of incentives in terms of improving innovation in Canada. However, there are 2 or 3 elements in the report which did not completely, I would say, or at least according to what we have clearly heard from the industry, fulfill the intent. That is to say, first of all, meeting the most important, largest companies in terms of investment and innovation, in terms of having a transparent, complete, adequate dialogue to better understand what the impact would be. Several Canadian companies are foreign held. So that decision, of course, does not depend entirely on Canada. And going to cinema going to the show in Canada might cost more, but the films are just as good.
Round of questioning. Yeah, we have no time.
Sorry, no problem.
Sorry. Mr. Hobeck.
Chair, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's good to see you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here. like to talk to all of you, but again, I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to just key in maybe a couple of you and just kind of get a feel for what your organizations are saying about a few issues. And I'll start off with you, Ms. Pullman. Roughly how many members do you have that make up the Canadian Federation of Independent Business?
We have 109,000 members.
109,000 members. And how many, based on talking to your members, you're in constant contact with them through surveying in different ways, what would they expect the public service pension should look like? What would they feel would be fair type of pension plan for the public service? Should it be better? Should it be, I guess just give us your opinion what your members would think of how that should look.
Well, our members fundamentally believe that public sector pensions and compensation should follow the private sector. It should be similar to what's available in the private sector. The overall compensation package should be similar as to what's in the private sector. And I think when you look at similar positions, especially at the mid-level, I think there are certain advantages to working in the public sector over the private sector, and one of the big areas is in the area of benefits, specifically pension benefits. So I think some of the things that we would like to see, and we'll continue to push for, these changes were a great start, but we believe things like looking at defined contribution plans, perhaps extending the retirement age to 65 to all government employees over time, similar to how the OAS changes are being implemented. So it isn't necessarily going to impact people who are close to retirement now, but perhaps those that are still maybe 15, 20 years away, rather than just waiting until for all the new ones that's starting in 2013. So those would be a couple of things. We also believe things like the bridge benefit might be something to be looked at. So those are some of the things that are just not available in the private sector that perhaps need to be looked at a little more closely in the public sector.
Mr. Thomas, going to your organization, again, roughly how many members do you have in your organization, and what would be their expectations of the public service for pensions? What do you think they would like to see, and what do you think they would consider to be a fair pension plan for our public service employees?
We point out that roughly about 12% of people who, we have about 75,000 supporters, and we note that only about 12% of Canadians outside of government now have a defined benefit pension plan. We believe that salaries, benefits, and retirement savings should be competitive for government, because government has to hire qualified staff. You want good staff, and you want them to be well compensated, but they shouldn't make more than the rest of us do. And we think that one of the ways that government's attracted employees is by offering all these back-end benefits, which look cheap to government. You know, they say, well, you know, we'll pay you less now, but you'll have pension benefits. Well, there are over 100 members of the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan who are at least 100 years of age. There are over 1,000 who are at least 90 years of age, and 10,000 who are at least 80 years of age. And in the Ontario teachers have compiled great stats, but you know, the average retirement age this year is 59. These people many of them will be retired for longer than they actually worked as teachers. And that's the trap that government is falling into by offering guaranteed indexed income for life to people starting as young as age 55. So it's terrific that you're moving to start to deal with that. And we think that you should put things on more of a cash basis. Maybe, you know, pay your staff what you need to get them to come and work for you, but don't offer them benefits, you know, 40 years down the road that the rest of us can't afford.
Again, in the business community, depending on what sector you're in, for example, one sector has to pay more to attract people to that sector versus another sector. And I think you could look across the wide variety of jobs amongst the government sector. You would use pay as the reward for the higher demand jobs than the lower demand jobs. Is that right?
Yeah, and let's face it, we have these situations where in some parts of Canada, the government's the highest paying employer in the region. Other parts of Canada, the government's scraping to find employees because the economy's hot and they can't pay enough. And I think government has to be more flexible about getting the people it needs to operate.
Mr. DeLuca, you made some comments about Canada's competitiveness, you know, 3rd to 5th and 9th to 13th. In your presentation, you talked about our competitiveness to attract investment, going from 3rd to 5th and 9th to 13th. I'm just kind of curious, what would those numbers look like if we didn't lower our corporate tax rate, if we didn't have the incentives to relocate in here? I know it's speculation, but can you give us an idea what that looked like? Plus, what would a carbon tax do to those numbers?
Mr. Hoback, sorry, you're out of time, but Mr. DeLuca, if you'd like to answer, we've got time for a very brief answer, but your 5 minutes are up.
Sure. Well, the concept related to the concept you're referring to is a concept which takes into consideration the total tax framework, and we're not suggesting that lowering the tax rates is not a good attractive feature. We, in fact, think it is. The problem, however, is in the fact that the risks and rewards are not timed properly, and the fact that we're competing against the large projects outside natural resources. We're quite competitive there, but so you can understand the impact there.
Thank you, Mr. Hoback. Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you. I'd like to begin with Ms. Pullman. Under C45, the 2012 hiring credit does not factor in to the 2011 does not factor in the 2011 hiring credit calculation. So the calculation under C45 is based on an employer's 2011 EI premiums before the hiring credit. As a result of that, for instance, a small company with 10 employees, $39,000 each in salary, in 2011 would pay premiums of $9,445. 2012, that would go up to $9,718. So would you acknowledge that small businesses, even those who qualify for the 2012 hiring credit, will still see their EI rates go up by 7 cents per $100 contribution in 2012 compared to what they paid in 2011?
Yes, that is true. That is the fact that the increase still applies even after the credit is in place. But we also feel at least it's some sort of credit that is available to small business owners, and so there is a bit of a break given to them when they do make that hiring. But that is one of the limitations of the credit, the way it's designed right now.
And beyond that, there's a disincentive for those businesses that break the $10,000 maximum, and actual disincentive to potentially increasing wages on one hand, or potentially increasing number of employees on the other hand. To give you an example, an employer who had 10 workers, again $39,000 each, would have qualified for the 2011 hiring credit, but if they give a wage increase of 1.3% in 2012, this would push the employer up over the 10,000 maximum, and they would not qualify for the 2012 hiring credit, and they would see their EI rate in 2012 actually rise by 12 cents per $100. So what should we do to address this disincentive for a small business to actually hire more people? Because there would be a number of small businesses in that category who would be teetering on the edge of that threshold.
I think there's a couple of things. We have strongly recommended for the last year or two to have the EI hiring credit expanded as well as extended beyond 2011 into 2012 and 2013. When I say expanded, meaning it should be available to firms with more than $10,000 in EI premiums, perhaps $15,000 or whatever. Perhaps it can be increased gradually every year to make sure that those folks are always captured. We would like to see that threshold expanded. Another alternative, of course, though, so that everybody would benefit, it would be to actually freeze EI premiums. And by freezing EI premiums, obviously, it's at a difficult time. That would be one solution. While that will add to the deficit in the EI account, what it does is it just adds a couple more years of paying down that deficit. Instead of having the deficit paid off by 2015, it would be paid off by 2017, 2018. We've done some modeling on that, and that is we've determined over time. So another option would be to freeze EI premiums.
And for the government not to raise EI premiums by the scheduled amount would be a $600 million boost to the economy, whereas the hiring credit for small business is actually only $125 million. So, and unemployment rates, as you said, Ms. McEwen, are still higher than they were pre-recession. And significantly higher depending on where you are in the country. There's a real gap. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, do I have
1 minute?
1 minute. On SHRED, Mr. Lucan, thank you very much for your intervention. We heard earlier today from a Mr. Cudmore, an accountant in Calgary, who used to be at the University of Calgary, about the impact on oil and gas sector and research in the oil and gas sector and the negative impact. The changes in SHRED, do you find it potentially risking the capacity for businesses and entrepreneurs and scientists to actually prioritize research and actually giving that control over to big government? There seems to be a shift with the Conservatives towards the bureaucracy making these decisions as opposed to the scientists and the entrepreneurs actually in the field. What would your comment be in terms of the risk potentially to innovation?
Well, my comments are based on surveys which we have performed, and industry has said it very clearly that they are in the best position to decide where the funds are to be invested. And that has been said time and time again and very, very clearly. And as much as they also indicate that it's perfectly acceptable for a government to identify certain strategic areas where areas of interest and the related funding of those should be governed centrally, but as it relates to determining how the investment should be made.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Mr. Jean.
Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses that came today. Mr. DeLuca, are you suggesting, I remember hearing your proposal and it went by pretty quickly, but are you suggesting that we get into picking more winners and losers, that the government do more direct funding? You're nodding your head in disagreement.
No, I'm nodding my head in disagreement, indeed. We are not suggesting that there not be any direct funding in strategic areas for strategic purposes and for strategic periods of time.
Because are you familiar with the McIntosh report
No.
in response to the Jenkins report?
No.
And I'm just wondering whether you would agree with this. One of the chief, and it's on page, I'm not sure of the report, but under Part 5, and it says the difficult task of picking winners and losers. One of the chief difficulties, and I quote, one of the chief difficulties with direct assistance is that we simply cannot have much confidence that government bureaucrats are well positioned to pick companies that are likely to succeed in the commercialization sweepstake. Would you agree with that? Okay. And would you also agree with this statement on the next page in relation to restricting the SHRED to small firms? In 2007, the last year with complete data, about $1.3 billion in SHRED credits was paid to CCPCs, while $1.8 billion was paid to large firms. The average payment to a large firm was $700,000, implying average SHRED eligible expenditures of somewhere on the order of $3 million. Restricting SHRED credits to the CCPCs will immediately reduce the SHRED budget by about 60%, which is likely to result in far more substantial savings than implementation of the Jenkins recommendations. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure about the 60%, but in general, I would agree with that, yes.
So do you think that larger firms, should not be eligible for SHRED credits? And
No.
that it should be just smaller?
No. The anchor tenants in Canada are important investors in innovation, and we have to acquire more of those, and one of the ways of doing so is through SHRED incentives.
Would you be surprised to find out that the Silicon Valley has pretty much the same amount of failures within 3 to 6 years as the IT sector in Canada? It's pretty much the same.
Not surprised at all. No.
Okay, so
that's common knowledge. Yes.
So whether the SHRED is effective or not, in essence, it has the same amount of failures over time, even though the SHRED credit is obviously available in a different nature in the United States.
It's a long sentence, but I guess the way I'll answer it, if I may, is to say that the SHRED is an incentive for taking risks.
Exactly,
So,
but whether or not the SHRED is effective is a question, because the same failures happen in Silicon Valley that doesn't have the same system as we have here, and obviously it's a much more robust industry.
Apples and
that
oranges.
is my point,
Yeah.
actually. Same failures, apples and oranges. Ms. Holman, I'm not sure how much more time. 2 minutes? I love you guys, okay? I got to be honest, I was a member of the CFIB for many years, And every time, since I've been an MP, every time I get responses from you to my office, I write them back, each and every person from my constituent that writes me, and I find them very, very helpful. And in fact, I find them so helpful, I want to spend my last 2 minutes going through your survey. I noticed that 64% of your members said that EI hiring credit was very or somewhat effective. So your members like this very much.
Absolutely, they like this. Yes, you can see that. Yeah.
Great. And in fact, looking at the PRPP, over 78% say they don't offer a retirement savings plan to their employees, and I'm just going to keep going if I may. And they say that because either it's too expensive, it's too complicated and burdensome, it is uncommon to have such benefits in my sector, I don't know where to start, no suitable plan for my business, and the financial risk exposure to my business is too great. I mean, they're all the major, it looks to me as if the most significant answer by far was those things that I've indicated.
Okay, about 30 seconds.
Isn't it fair to say that our proposal with PRPP takes care of all of those issues? I mean, it really does, doesn't it?
Yeah, we're hopeful that it will take care of all of those issues. The question now becomes, are the provinces going to implement it and are financial institutions going to implement it properly?
But it seems like a good proposal
the
for
framework
from your
we
members.
think is a good one, yeah.
Okay. And the final question is, I'm not surprised at all by your slide on slide 9. The amount of people that do not believe in small business that they can retire until 68 or never. It doesn't surprise me. So certainly we should bring in our private sector realities to the public service. Wouldn't you agree with that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jean. Mr. Marsden, please.
Well, I'm going to be focusing my questions primarily to Ms. McEwen. Am I saying that correctly? But I have to, we've had some agreement here that kind of surprised me a little bit. Ms. Pullman, when you talked about the 2015 deadline for taking care of the deficit should be crowded out to 2017, you actually just publicly agreed with the NDP. But excuse me a second. And Mr. Thomas, you talked about the need for pensions in amongst your group, and I agree with you. We got 12 million Canadians who don't have pensions, and I just wanted to point my perspective out to that. Now, that may or may not be accurate in Ms. Pullman's case, and I can see my friend here is going to proceed a little further on that. Going to Ms. McEwen, the reason I raised the pension issue is we have a national pension plan now that the CLC has been out there promoting an increase to, and that, to my mind, is a way to addressing the problem with less of the complication, the PRPPs. And Ms. Pullman's right, there's concerns about whether or not the industry or whether or not the provinces will actually go forward on the PRPPs. At least one province says they don't want to. I think it was Ontario. Now, that may change with change of leadership. So the issue of pensions is obviously very present in everybody's mind. So having raised that particular point in regards to the increase of CPP and that, and it's a well-known stated position of the CLC, the NDP as well, so I don't think we have to go into that. I'll shift gears here. It's just that when I heard what sounded like some agreement, I wanted to raise that. The provisions of EI funding that you see in this bill, I've heard through rumors that there's some folks in the CLC that were concerned about it. I have a connection going back, I should label it. The CLC with 3.3 million members was established in 1883, and for 14 years I was a president of a Labour council in Hamilton. So they have it, yes, 1883. There's a long, I wasn't quite that long, but my point is that the CLC has had a long history of advocating for workers, and in this case we have concerns about EI that I'd like you to address.
Okay, are you talking about concerns about EI financing?
Yes, within the bill that we're talking about.
Right, okay. So our concerns about the financing are, first, just as the CFIB stated, this is one area of agreement where we would like the funds to be separate from the general account. We want to make sure that if there are surpluses, that those aren't stolen as they were before. So there was $57 billion of surplus that was stolen. And I think before that, there were even surpluses that were taken away from the account, right? So we want it separated and managed to the interests of the premium payers, the employers and the employees, because that is really what it's there for, right? It's to help the labor market function more effectively. So we're concerned that it be separate, and then we're concerned that when the board is reinstated, or if the board is reinstated, that there be a provision for a tripartite control of those funds, where business has a voice and labor has a voice to have joint control, effectively joint control over how the surpluses are managed.
Presuming
well, the government
as well.
has some control.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to clarify that one point. Going back to the PRPPs and pension splitting is an issue. Like you notice, I kind of fall back on pensions because I had a lot to do with them for 3 years as the critic for our party for them. And I again have heard from people in the labor movement that were talking about concerns about that. Do you share those concerns?
Absolutely. So this bill does provide for PRPPs to be subject to pension splitting as well. So that's one concern. We are concerned about pension splitting and the adverse effects of that for low-income and medium-income families in terms of where you're putting your tax expenditure dollars. And then we also, as you say, if you want to make a simple pension plan that employers can offer, that's portable between jobs, that is efficient in terms of every dollar into CPP, you get more out. Defined benefit pensions are more efficient to run, and the larger it is. The CPP is already separate, so government can't get their hands on that money and take it. So that it's controlled in a way that benefits the people who pay into it.
Well, we'd also have to open it up. We'd also have to open up to allow for some of the people that can't get in now to be able to get in Mr. Thomas's case. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Marsden, we'll go to Mr. Adler, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon. I want to just start with Ms. Pullman. Mr. Marsden was talking about increasing CPP payments. By doing that, would you not have to? Would not businesses have to pay more into CPP?
Yes.
And what would that do to your membership? How would they react to something like that?
They would be pretty unhappy. It's a payroll taxes, and I talked about it in the presentation. Payroll taxes have the greatest effect on the growth of a business, and CPP is, they pay 50% of the cost to CPP for every employee. So it's a substantial, it would have a substantial impact to increase CPP, and we have fought against it as much as possible.
And far be it for me to be partisan about this, but tough but fair. And so people would be presumably laid off. There'd be a rise in unemployment. The more costs you put onto business, they're passed through the system, and if the costs are too onerous, people are laid off, right?
Well, for smaller firms, payroll taxes certainly have an impact on their choices about hiring, and I think a lot of them would probably take a second look at whether they can afford to hire someone, because now they have to pay more for that person. The other thing I want to mention on CPP is that for anybody who's self-employed, they pay both shares. So when you increase it, you're not just increasing it for the employee, you're also for that self-employed person, it's a double increase. So it's a substantial amount that they would have to pay into, they would be required to pay into a system where they may want to use those funds to pay into something different than the CPP system.
Okay, now Bill C-45 brings in some changes to the public sector pension plan and system, bring it more in line with the private sector. And before, in advance of Budget 2012, the CFIB said, quote, start bringing federal public sector wages and benefits more in line with the private sector. Federal public sector employees should increase their pension contributions from the current approximate 36% of their pension to 50% over time, which is the norm for most provincial public sector employees. Can I get your reaction to the change that is taking place in Bill C-45?
Yes, we support the increase to 50-50. As I said, it's the norm in most other levels of government. I think it's appropriate for public sector pension employees to be paying 50% of the bill. We also support the increase of the retirement age to age 65 for all new employees.
Yeah, and this would, of course, promote fairness among all workers. Could you also comment on the how these changes would lead to greater sustainability for the public sector?
Well, I think especially increasing the age of retirement to 65 would hopefully help cut some of the costs, putting more of the public sector employees, their contribution higher would also help sort of sustain the cost of the system. However, these are small measures at this point, and they're the great step in the right direction, but we think more needs to be done in order to really deal with some of the sustainability issues that are going to be coming at us down the road.
Now, the extension of the small business hiring tax credit, it's estimated will save businesses about $200 million in the course of the year. What, in your estimation, would businesses do with this extra cash? Would they presumably invest in job creation, expand their businesses? Could you comment?
Yeah, and we've asked about those, what they would do, and generally it's exactly that. They invest it back into their business, usually through either, sometimes it's adding extra employees, sometimes it's buying new equipment, sometimes it's paying down debt, to be fair, right? These are things that are real for small business owners.
Yeah. 1 minute? Okay. Now, we hear a lot about businesses there's this $500 billion in cash out there that businesses are sitting on. Are any of your members sitting on large hoards of cash?
No, I could most assuredly tell you that there isn't some big pot of gold sitting in the closet of the small business owners that we represent, no.
How many members again do you have?
109,000.
109,000. Okay. Okay, that does it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Adler. We'll go to Ms. Nash, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I have a couple of questions about employment insurance, and this is it's a benefit that most people hope they'll never have to claim because it's designed to help transition someone when they face the catastrophe of job loss. And sadly, we're in a situation today when only about 40% of those Canadians who are in that situation of unemployment are able to get these benefits. And I heard the first three witnesses today, Ms. Pullman, Ms. McEwen, and Mr. Thomas, talk about the money that was shifted from EI premiums that was paid by individuals and by employers that government used for general revenue. We had a bit of a discussion about this yesterday, and officials from the government said that this was just an accounting change, and that it did not mean that this money was actually taken out of the EI fund. And I wonder if any of you would like to comment on that, because I had a different perspective on it, but that's what our government officials had told us.
Just before we do, the bells are ringing. Can I get unanimous consent? I'd like to get as many members in as possible to question witnesses. Okay, I see I have it. So Ms. Nash. Yeah. Ms. Pullman, you'd like to start with that?
I find that an interesting comment being made, since these were employment insurance is an insurance, so you're paying a premium, so it's supposed to be there for those people that pay the premium. Hence is why we have always called it a tax, because essentially what happened is those premiums were then taken away and used for other government priorities, and making it essentially a tax. As much as people don't like to hear that, it's what it is. And so it's funny to me that they say it's just an accounting change, when in fact that money, from our perspective, came from employers and employees, and it includes some interest on top of that. But fundamentally, I think most employers and employees to this day still feel very strongly that that money was taken out of the system and away from them.
And the fact that subsequently there was a premium increase, because of course we were in a period of high unemployment when over the economic cycle, that money normally would, the surplus would cover the increase in demand for a period of unemployment, and instead there's been a premium increase. Any other comments?
Absolutely, and when I hear Ms. Pullman talking about the small business hiring credit, I think that would have been a far better policy, would have been to reinstate some of that, so that the EI operating account didn't go into deficit, and so premiums didn't have to rise during a very weak recovery, when small businesses are still struggling to kind of get through. So having either freezing premiums, or we even suggested lowering through the recession, to lower premiums during the recession, that would have given a bigger break to employers and a bigger incentive to hire.
I think sometimes when people feel no, they don't want taxes to go up, but when there's a premium or a tax, if you will, that is a dedicated fund, I think people feel, okay, well, I support that. And in this case, it was intended to be a dedicated fund that ended up going into general revenue. And as I had said yesterday, there's multiple governments that have done that. So I don't know, Mr. Thomas, if you have any comments on it, but I guess what I'm interested in is if any of you want to express more fully what measures and protections we should have in place so that this funding that employers and employees pay is directed for its stated goal.
Okay, there's about 45 seconds, but Mr. Thomas, we'll start with you.
Working Canadians and their employers were gouged to the tune of $57 billion to create a fund for a storm like the one we experienced, and the money wasn't there. And just when we needed lower payroll taxes to stimulate the economy and get people back to work, because the money had been taken, now all of a sudden we have higher and higher payroll taxes, and the credit is a very worthy is a very worthy stopgap. But the fact is, if the money hadn't been taken by previous governments, then it wouldn't be necessary. Yes, a suggestion: Canada Pension Plan has the confidence of Canadians because there are assets behind it. The money hasn't been taken by government for other purposes, and anyone can go online and see what their entitlement is, because those funds, the funds of them and their employer, are put in an account with their name. There's over $4,000 a year for a working couple that's being siphoned out of their net worth and then shipped to to pay for these EI programs. And you could do a lot to rebuild the balance sheets of Canadians and deal with the personal debt problem by putting EI into a CPP-style rainy day fund.
Thank you. Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time on that round. We'll go to Mr. Van Kesteren, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Pullman, I too am a big fan of your organization, and I was a member since 1985 when I first got into business myself. I understand a lot of things, filled out all those surveys as well, and as Mr. Jean said, experience a lot of the frustrations that a lot of business people feel today. Mr. DeLuca, your organization is the third largest in the world, I think. Can you switch me over to this mic here too? Thanks. The third largest in the world. You must do some work for governments, and without asking you to give state secrets, your actuaries, have you looked at some of the pension plans, possibly not Canada Pension Plan, but some in America and some of the other countries, and just seeing how viable they are? Is there a running tally on some of these?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not in my area of expertise, so I can't really comment on that, unfortunately.
However, do you have a personal opinion? I mean, obviously, we're hearing a lot of, and they're wonderful ideas. I don't think anybody would disagree that we shouldn't have pensions for everyone, and the money should always be there. But I guess my question to you would be that in order for those things to happen, the funds have to be there. And how are our pension plans looking to date as far as viability?
Well, I'm not sure what Deloitte's view on this is. Quite frankly, as I said, it's not my area of expertise, but my own personal opinion, which would echo Mr. Thomas's, is that it needs to somehow reflect private industry, and with all of the measures that come with that. Only because the resources that are being attracted are the same resources, and therefore you need to have the same rules of engagement. That would be my view.
And thank you. I think that's fair. And Mr. Thomas, I'm going to ask you the same question too, but I do also want to ask you. You mentioned that these funds were rated, and we can have a discussion about that. It was a former government. It's immaterial at this point, but these monies weren't just suddenly dispersed throughout the world. They went to Canadians for the most part. So wouldn't you agree that the government of the day that was confronted with a huge deficit situation found it necessary to take those monies to pay down the debt. But wasn't it a spending problem that we had in government at that time that caused this crisis?
Yes, and it's a spending problem that persists, and it's I won't start talking about pork barreling. Oh, sure, I'll talk about pork. I mean, ACOA, FEDNAV, all of. If you look at the long-term track record of your corporate welfare organizations, it's not a good one. The ACOA wrote off something like $22 million or $222 million in the last fiscal year on economic development funds that were given out in corporate welfare at different companies in Atlantic Canada. I mean,
The point I want to make, and maybe Ms. Poolman can answer to this too, that in your organization, how many of those were able to say, yeah, we received that funding, and my members all didn't pay that back as well? So how many of your members, independent businesses?
You mean funding for
the funding that Mr. Thomas mentioned?
Yeah, no, our members don't necessarily ever benefit from any types of grants or programs from economic development agencies. So,
the long and the short is that there's money coming into the government coffers, and there's money going out, and it's the sole responsibility of governments to handle that and to manage that prudently. And this government is beginning to do that. And so, is it fair to say that we, as was suggested on the other side, that we need to expand our CPP or expand our pensions when we have an economy that's contracting?
The dangers of expanding CPP is what you saw at the Caisse de Dépôt and the financial meltdown. They lost a third of the wealth of retired Quebecers because it's a compelled government savings program with a single investor essentially, and instead of having many investors investing their own retirement savings as prudently as they can, you have people taking big risks, and everyone suffers.
Thank you, Mr. Van Kesteren. Monsieur Mai, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeLuca, earlier we had a lot of witnesses who came and talked about the SR&ED tax credit, saying that the action taken by the government is not beneficial to the manufacturing sector, that there would be job losses because of a loss of investment. And we also heard on the other side that one of the reasons why they were going forward with these measures in Bill C-45 is to reduce the red tape and paper burden. And yet we also heard that it's not helpful in that respect. So could you tell us what its impact will be on the manufacturing sector and talk about why they are opposed to the measures taken by the government in this area? Well, the budget measures have absolutely no effect in terms of simplifying things. They're completely separate issues, and there's no connection between the two. The manufacturing sector feels it is forced. In other words, rather than being encouraged to invest more and to hire PhDs and engineers and so forth, they feel that they're being tightened up financially, and therefore investment in research will suffer the consequences. Now, if we're looking at budgets and considering that productivity in Canada is dropping, we have fewer and fewer PhDs here compared to other countries and so forth. If we really want to ensure we have a viable future with respect to investment, would you say that that type of tax credit is important in terms of the future? Yes, absolutely. Productivity is dependent on capital expenditures in part. So withdrawing capital expenditures in the name of simplification, I mean, it's a real disconnect. Thank you. Ms. McEwen.
a lot with the other side is the increase between the gap between the rich and the poor, the fact that there is more and more inequalities. You've talked about income splitting. Can you tell us about more in terms of whether or not that will help or reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, or what the influence is?
Certainly, in general, what we see is that income splitting or pension income splitting, which has been implemented now, is benefits higher income individuals more than lower income individuals. And part of this is because if seniors are unattached, that's 30% of seniors are unattached, they don't benefit. Seniors who are unattached are more likely to live in poverty, they're more vulnerable. And if you pay, the less tax you pay, the less you benefit from this type of tax incentive or tax expenditure. So the more income you pay, the more you're going to benefit from this. And particularly if you have a higher income spouse and a lower income spouse, you'll benefit more. So what we say is if you look at this and you take a look at it with a gender analysis, with inequality analysis, you'll see that the tax expenditure would be far better spent improving GIS and keeping OAS at 65 for those who need to retire at 65. Not everybody can work past 65. And in fact, Canadians who can work are continuing to do so, especially with the financial crisis. Their pensions have been decimated, so they're continuing to work.
Yeah, very quickly, Mr. Thomas, in this and C45, there are provisions regarding transfer pricing. So basically, we want to reduce or do you believe the government should do more in terms of tackling tax havens and tax evasion?
Very brief response, please.
Yes, we do.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I see Mr. Mai. We'll go to Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make a brief, three quick questions in terms of SHRED and then move on to the pension issue. But Mr. DeLuca, would you agree that there was problems with predictability? The changes we're making to SHRED are sort of a comprehensive response to the Jenkins report. So, so a quick yes or no, I guess. Were there issues with predictability for companies with the SHRED program?
The budget does not address predictability.
Yeah. But again, we have a comprehensive response. Were there issues with fees that were being charged to organizations at times that, you know, were really creating huge issues for the company? In actual fact, a lot of money not actually going back to the companies, but perhaps to do research and development, but consulting fees?
So predictability is one thing. What you're referring to is the cost of administration of the program and the cost of getting the credits, which is a function of different private sector attributes. But the bottom line is that just like in any other sector of finance, people would acquire services, and the more complex the program is to administer, the more requirements there are. I guess I'm trying to answer your question as simply as I can.
And you know, certainly what we heard too is the capital component is most complex. But Mr. Thomas, to move towards pensions, could you briefly talk? You know, I always remember conversation as a fairly young adult, and I think there was a teacher, there was a physician, and there was someone that ran a small business, and you know, certainly the physician was complaining about having to take care of his own retirement. The teacher was making their comments regarding their both their wages and their retirement having a defined benefit pension plan. And I can still clearly recall the small business person indicating, you know, of course I'm paying for both, and was struggling. So first of all, in terms of defined benefit programs, how did the federal government pension plan compare to a municipal or some of the provincial public service plans?
Government pension plans are, when you look at accrual rates, the 2% accrual rate is common with many municipal plans permit these spiking. They use sometimes as few as the last 3 years of earnings. So you have what they call the sprint to the finish line, where you get 50-something police officers suddenly pulling overtime and doing a lot of doing a lot of court duty, and in Ontario showing up on the Sunshine List with these big incomes way in excess of 6 figures that then play a big role in establishing the retirement rate that they're going to enjoy for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And the Government of Canada, by taking steps to rein in some of these things and provide for a later normal age of retirement, is going a long way to reducing its exposure. It needs to go further, but I think it's been estimated this is going to save Canadian taxpayers a couple of $2 billion, the reforms that are included in this bill, perhaps $2.6 billion, and we applaud that.
I do understand that a lot of perhaps the provincial public sector employees, it's a 50-50 already. Is that a more common cost sharing?
About 1 minute.
It's tough to generalize, but certainly with regard to contributions, federal government employees have an advantage, and it's an unfair advantage. We believe that compensation should be, the wage and benefit structure should be made competitive with the rest of us who don't work for the government.
And a quick, this is just a one number answer, I guess. Ms. Pullman, do you remember when things changed in terms of the EI fund? You talked about significant dollars being redirected into general revenue. Can you talk about when that changed?
That changed in 2009. At that point in time, when the Canadian Employment Insurance Financing Board was created, all that money was then disappeared, and it was down to zero once again. And we thought it was the right idea, but it was the wrong time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. McLeod. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, for your contributions to our study of this bill. If you have anything further, please submit it to the clerk. We'll ensure that all members get it. Thank you so much for being here, especially on short notice. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.